The train arrived 20 minutes late into Black Ridge, which should have been the first sign that the day wasn't going to go the way Evelyn Harper had planned. She'd been sitting upright for the last 4 hours, her back aching from the wooden bench, her fingers working a loose thread on the hem of her traveling coat without realizing she was doing it. Outside the window, the landscape had gradually thinned, trees giving way to scrub brush, hills flattening into long stretches of pale yellow grass that seemed to go on forever in every direction. It wasn't like anything she'd seen growing up in Ohio, where there were always fences and barns and neighbors close enough to hear if you called out. Out here, the land just sat there, vast and indifferent, as if it hadn't noticed people existed yet. She told herself the nervousness in her stomach was normal. Any woman would feel it, traveling this far to marry a man she'd only known through letters. Thomas Aldridge had written to her first. Or someone claiming to be Thomas Aldridge had. She would come to understand that distinction later, after the damage was done. The letters had been good ones. Careful and warm, not overly flowery, with the kind of specific detail that made them feel real, the way the frost came early in the valley, the color of the hills in October, how his horse had a habit of nipping at shirt buttons if you stood too close. She'd read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She'd believed every word. The train shuddered to a stop, and she gathered her bag from the rack overhead, her one good traveling case already on the platform, checked through from Columbus. She stepped down onto the platform and looked around. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform. A family reuniting near the far end, a man in overalls carrying a wooden crate, 2 women in conversation who didn't look up when the train arrived, a station master in a blue vest moving toward the mail car. No one who looked like they were waiting for a bride. Evelyn stood beside her case and watched the other passengers disperse. The family moved toward a wagon. The man with the crate climbed onto a buckboard. Within 10 minutes, she was essentially alone on the platform, just her and the station master, who was now dragging a canvas bag of mail toward the station door. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Thomas Aldridge. He was supposed to meet me here." The station master paused, frowning slightly in a way that made her chest tighten. "Aldridge," he repeated, like he was turning the word over to check if he recognized it. "Thomas Aldridge. He owns a ranch somewhere north of town, I believe. We were to be married." The frown deepened. "I don't know that name, ma'am, and I've been working this station 8 years. You might know him as Tom. He said he was well established here." "I'm sorry," the station master said, and he did look sorry, which somehow made it worse. "I know most of the ranchers in this county. That name doesn't ring a bell." She thanked him and sat down on the bench outside the station door and told herself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd given her the wrong stop. Maybe there were 2 Black Ridges and she'd gotten off at the wrong one. Maybe his horse had thrown a shoe. Maybe any number of things that weren't the thing she was starting to be afraid it was. She waited 2 hours. The sun moved across the sky with complete disregard for her situation. A dog wandered onto the platform, sniffed at her traveling case, and wandered off again. The station master came back out twice, and on the second pass he asked if she'd like him to send a message to the sheriff's office. And she said no, she was fine, thank you, and looked away so he wouldn't see her expression. At the 2-hour mark, she went inside and asked to use the station's ledger of local landowners. The station master gave it to her without comment. There was no Thomas Aldridge in the register. There was no Aldridge at all. She sat with that for a long moment, long enough for the reality to stop feeling like a mistake and start feeling like the truth. Someone had written her those letters. Someone had described a ranch and a horse that nipped at buttons and frost coming early to the valley, and none of it belonged to a real man. She had sold her mother's silver brooch to buy the train ticket. She had told her landlord she wouldn't be renewing her lease. She had written to her cousin Margaret to say she was getting married and would write again from her new home once she was settled. She had nothing to go back to. And now it seemed she had nothing here either. The thing about humiliation, the particular kind that comes from being fooled completely, is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. First it felt like confusion, then disbelief, then a slow burning shame that started in her face and worked its way down. She sat very still in the station and breathed carefully and did not cry, because crying would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for yet. She was still sitting there, turning over her options, which were sparse, to put it generously, when the station door banged open and a girl came in at a near run, pulling up short when she nearly collided with Evelyn's traveling case. The girl was maybe 10 or 11, with dark hair escaping from two braids, a smear of something that might have been axle grease on her cheek, and boots that were a size too big. She looked at Evelyn with the frank assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't staring. "Are you the lady who was waiting for Thomas Aldridge?" the girl asked. Evelyn blinked. "How do you know about that?" "Mr. Henley at the post office told Mabel Drucker, who told the woman who runs the feed store, who told my pa's hired hand, Walt, who told me." The girl said this without any apparent sense that this was unusual. "Word gets around fast here. There's not much else to talk about." "I see." Evelyn wasn't sure what to do with this information. "And you are?" "Sadie Walker." The girl stuck out her hand with a directness that caught Evelyn off guard. She shook it. "My pa's Cole Walker. He runs the Walker Ranch north of town. We raise cattle, mostly, some horses. I heard what happened to you, and I have a proposition." Evelyn looked at this child with axle grease on her face and boots 3 sizes too worn, and felt something shift. Not hope exactly, more like curiosity, which at this particular moment was almost as useful. "You have a proposition?" Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." Sadie pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited. "Our ranch is in trouble. My ma died 2 years ago, and Pa doesn't—" She paused, choosing words carefully in a way that seemed older than her face. "He doesn't manage the business side well. He's a good rancher, he just doesn't do the money part right. We're going to lose the ranch if something doesn't change soon. Walt says we might not make it to spring." "I'm sorry to hear that," Evelyn said, meaning it, "but I'm not sure what that has to do with me." "You can read and write," Sadie said. "You know figures. You came out here to run a household, and you answered a rancher's advertisement, which means you know something about ranching or thought you could learn. And you're stuck." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten slightly. "Stuck is one word for it." "I mean it practically, not as an insult," Sadie said, unfazed. "You don't have money to get home. You gave up your situation to come here. And there's nowhere else in Black Ridge that's hiring, because I checked on the way over here, and Mrs. Brennan at the boarding house said she doesn't need anyone, and the hotel doesn't either." She folded her hands on the table. "Come out to our ranch, just for a while. See if you can help. Pa needs someone who understands business, and I need—" Something flickered in her expression, brief and quickly covered. "I need someone who isn't Walt." Evelyn sat with this for a moment. It was objectively a strange situation. She was being propositioned by an 11-year-old in a train station in a town where she knew no one, with no money and no clear path forward, to go work on a failing ranch for a widower she'd never met. And yet— "Your father," she said. "Does he know you're here?" Sadie hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "He will." Evelyn almost laughed. "He doesn't know. He'll agree when I explain it to him. He always listens to me eventually." "That's reassuring," Evelyn said, and she wasn't sure if she was being sarcastic or not. She looked down at her traveling case, at her hands, at the ledger still open on the table to the page with no Aldridge on it. "I'd need a wage, small as it might be. I need to eat, and I can't do that on goodwill. I can work that out. And I'd want it understood from the beginning that I'm there temporarily to help with your accounts and your books, not as—" She chose her words carefully. "Not as anything else, just a hired hand who happens to work with numbers." "That's fine," Sadie said. "That's exactly what I'm asking." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. This child who had walked into a train station and made a business pitch with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it for years, who had checked with every potential employer in town before coming here, who was carrying something much heavier than a 10-year-old should carry, and was doing it without complaint. "All right," Evelyn said. "Show me to this ranch." The Walker Ranch was about 4 miles north of Black Ridge, reached by a rutted road that wound through scrub brush and past 2 dry creek beds that Sadie said sometimes ran in spring. The wagon Sadie had come in, a battered thing pulled by a mule named Cobb, who she informed Evelyn had strong opinions about mud, took them there in about an hour, with Sadie filling most of the silence with information about the ranch in a way that Evelyn suspected was both genuine and strategic. The girl wanted her to understand what she was getting into. She also wanted her to stay once she saw it. What Evelyn saw when they crested the last rise was a ranch that had clearly been something once. The main house was solid, 2 stories, good bones even if the paint had peeled badly on the south face. The barn was large, well built. There were maybe 40 head of cattle in the far pasture, she couldn't count exactly, and several horses in the corral near the barn. But she could also see the fences that needed repair, the equipment rusting near the barn door, the kitchen garden that had gone mostly to seed, the shingles loose on the western side of the house roof. A ranch running on momentum, not management. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up. He was tall, lean in the way that came from work rather than luck, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of weathered face you got from spending most of your life outdoors. He was wiping his hands on a rag, and his expression when he saw Evelyn in the wagon next to his daughter was something complicated. Not welcoming, not hostile, more like someone bracing for news they've already guessed won't be good. "Sadie," he said, and the single word carried a lot of weight. "Pa, this is Evelyn Harper. She came in on today's train. She's good with numbers and she needs work, and I told her she could come see the ranch." Cole Walker looked at Evelyn the way a man looks at a problem he didn't create and isn't sure he has the energy to address. "You told her she could come see the ranch," he repeated. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Could we maybe talk about this privately for a minute, Sadie? You can say whatever you want in front of Miss Harper, Pa. She already knows we're in trouble." There was a pause. Cole's jaw tightened. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that she would come to recognize over time as his default when life surprised him, a kind of controlled frustration, not angry, just tired. "I apologize for my daughter," he said. "Don't," Evelyn said. "She was straightforward with me. I appreciate that." She climbed down from the wagon before he could help her or not help her. She didn't want to wait and find out which one he'd choose. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Walker. I'm offering to work. If you look at your books and decide you don't need the help, I'll find another arrangement. But from what I can see writing in, it might be worth an hour of your time." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he looked at the ranch and then at his daughter, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that watching got you further than asking. "Fine," he said. "Come inside." The books were worse than she'd expected. Cole brought them out to the kitchen table without comment. A ledger, a stack of loose receipts and invoices, some papers she eventually identified as the terms of a loan from a man named Hargrove at the Black Ridge Bank, dated 14 months earlier. She didn't say anything for a long time. Just read. Sadie had gone to the barn to do the evening feeding, either because she genuinely had chores or because she'd decided her work here was done and it was better to let the adults be. Walt, the hired hand, a weathered, quiet man in his 50s who seemed to communicate primarily through hat tilting, had disappeared somewhere after a brief introduction. It was just Evelyn and Cole in the kitchen, him standing by the window with a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold 20 minutes ago, her at the table. "When did your wife manage the accounts?" she asked. "She didn't." He paused. "She could have. She was better at it than me, but I thought I could handle it, and He stopped. "I didn't handle it." She'd heard that particular kind of admission before. Not self-pity, just fact. She looked back at the ledger. The ranch had taken out the loan to replace a well that had gone dry and to purchase 20 additional head of cattle that were supposed to expand the herd's output. It wasn't a bad plan on paper, but the loan terms were steep, the payments quarterly, and what had happened was a bad winter 2 years back followed by a drought summer, and 2 of the cattle had died of something that got into the herd before they could isolate it. And Cole had missed 1 quarterly payment, just one, which had triggered a penalty clause buried in the terms that increased the interest rate by almost a third. She read that clause 3 times to make sure she was reading it right. "Mr. Walker," she said, "did you read this loan agreement before you signed it?" "I read it." "Did you have anyone else look at it? A lawyer maybe, or someone familiar with lending terms?" The silence told her the answer. "The penalty clause on page 3, she said. "Have you seen what it does to your interest rate?" He came to the table and looked over her shoulder at where she was pointing. She heard him breathe out slowly through his nose. "I saw it," he said. "I thought I'd make the payments. And when you missed one?" "I didn't know it kicked in right away. I thought there'd be a grace period." She looked at the numbers again. With the increased rate, He was paying significantly more per quarter than the original terms would have required. He was essentially running to stand still, making payments, but barely keeping pace with the interest, not significantly reducing the principal. "You've been making these payments," she said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone since then." "So you're not in default?" "No, but I'm going to be." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "At the end of the year, I need to make a final large payment, or the bank has the right to call the full loan. I don't have it. I won't have it unless something changes significantly." Evelyn looked at the numbers, at the loan terms, at the production records, sparse as they were. "How many head are you running?" 42 right now. "What's your arrangement with the buyers in Tucson? I saw references to shipments, but the records are incomplete." "I sell through Mercer Trading twice a year. They take a cut, but they have the buyers." "What cut?" he told her. She kept her face neutral, but it was steep. "And you have no other revenue streams? Hay, crops, horses?" "Some hay. A little. We sell horses occasionally." "Occasionally," she made a note. "Do you own your water rights?" "Yes, registered." "That's something." She sat back. "I won't pretend this is simple. You're not ruined yet, but you're close. The loan terms are punishing, and Mercer is taking more than they should. But there are things here that can be worked with if the approach changes." She looked at him directly. "I need full access to everything. All the accounts, all the correspondence, all the agreements. And I need you to tell me the truth when I ask questions, even when it's uncomfortable." Cole looked at her with that same unreadable expression from the yard. "You've been here 40 minutes. "I know, but you're running out of time to be cautious." Another silence. She could hear Sadie outside, the sound of the barn door, the cattle shifting. "All right," he said finally. "You can have what you need." "I'll also need a place to stay. I can sleep in the barn if—" "Barn. You'll sleep in the house," he said. Not warmly, but not reluctantly either. "Sadie will show you the spare room." He paused. "Room and board. I can't pay you cash, not right now. We can revisit that when things improve." She wasn't sure they would improve, but she also wasn't sure they wouldn't. The spare room was small and cold and smelled of cedar from an old chest in the corner. Sadie showed her in with a lamp and stood in the doorway while Evelyn set her traveling case on the floor and looked around. "It was Ma's sewing room," Sadie said. "Before." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. There was a small window facing east, a narrow bed with a quilt that someone had made with careful attention, a hook on the wall for clothes. "It's fine," Evelyn said. "Thank you, Sadie." The girl lingered. "Are you going to stay?" Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. It creaked. The quilt was faded, but clean. "I said I would. I mean, after you see how bad it really is. Pa didn't tell you about the foreclosure letter." Evelyn looked up. "There's a foreclosure letter?" "From Hargrove at the bank. Came 3 weeks ago. It's not official yet, but it says if the end-of-year payment isn't made in full, they'll begin proceedings." Sadie said this with the flat, tired tone of someone who'd been carrying information too long and was relieved to put it down. "Pa put it in the desk. He didn't want to show you because he thought you'd leave." "Why didn't you tell me when you came to the station?" "Because I needed you to come first," Sadie said simply. "If I told you everything, you might have said no." Evelyn sat with that. It was manipulative in the guileless way children were sometimes manipulative. Not deceptive exactly, just strategic. This girl had looked at her situation and seen a problem and a solution and connected the two with a 10-year-old's absolute confidence that the ends justified the means. She should have been irritated. She found she wasn't entirely. "Get some sleep," Evelyn said. "I'll look at everything in the morning." Sadie nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. "Miss Harper, I'm glad you came. Even if it doesn't work, I just wanted someone to try." She left before Evelyn could answer. The first week was an education. Evelyn was up before dawn each morning, not by plan, but because the ranch woke early. Cole was out by 5, Walt not far behind, and Sadie had a way of appearing at the kitchen table at 5:30, with the expectation of breakfast that she'd apparently been managing herself for some time. The kitchen was functional rather than comfortable, with mismatched crockery and a stove that had a trick to it that Evelyn learned on the second day when it nearly smoked her out. She cooked because it made sense, and because she needed to understand the ranch's daily rhythms if she was going to manage anything effectively. Cole ate whatever she put in front of him without comment, which she initially took for indifference and later realized was just the habit of someone who'd been eating alone or eating bad food for 2 years and had stopped having expectations. Between meals, she worked through the papers, all of them. The loan, the Mercer contracts, the receipts, what little there was of a cattle registry, the correspondence with suppliers. She built a picture that was, in several ways, worse than she'd initially thought. The Mercer contract was not just taking a large cut. It contained a clause that prevented Cole from selling to any other buyer in the region for the duration of the agreement, which ran another 14 months. He was locked in. The well replacement, the original purpose of the loan, had been done with materials that were functional but not the most cost-effective, and she suspected the contractor had overcharged. That money was spent, nothing to be done about it now. But the water rights were genuine and documented, and she found reference in old correspondence to a proposal from a man in Tucson who had been interested in leasing grazing rights on the northern section of the property 2 years ago. The deal had never gone through because, as best she could reconstruct, Cole had never responded to the final letter. She brought this to him on the 5th evening after dinner. "Nathan Briggs," she said, setting the letter on the table. "Do you know this name?" Cole looked at the letter and something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, but the look of someone recognizing something they'd set down and forgotten about. "He reached out a while back. I didn't get back to him." "When his letter arrived, had your wife recently died?" A pause. "About 3 months before." She didn't press that point. "The offer was for seasonal grazing rights on your North 40. It wasn't a large amount, but it was reliable, and it didn't conflict with your cattle operation." She looked at him. "Is he still in the territory, do you know?" "I think so. He runs a sheep operation out of—" He stopped. "Wait. You think he'd still be interested?" "I think it's worth finding out. The property hasn't changed. If he still needs that grazing access and he's a reasonable man, there might be a deal to be made. It wouldn't solve everything, but it's income that doesn't require you to do anything different." Cole was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. "I should have answered that 2 years ago." "You should have," she agreed, not unkindly. "But you didn't, and that's done. The question is whether it's still possible now." He looked up at her. It was one of the first times she felt like he was actually seeing her rather than processing her as a problem he hadn't asked for. "You really think you can fix this?" "I think I can give it a serious chance," she said. "I'm not making promises I can't keep. But the situation has more options than you've been working with. Some of it is just—" She chose her word carefully. "Attention. Things that needed to be followed up on and weren't." He nodded slowly. "I'll find out where Briggs is." She'd also drafted a letter to the bank, not to Hargrove directly, but requesting a review of the penalty clause terms on the basis that they had not been adequately explained at signing. She wasn't sure it would go anywhere, but it created a paper trail, and sometimes that mattered. She hadn't told Cole about the letter yet. She'd tell him when she had a response. The town was another matter. Black Ridge had roughly 300 people, which was enough to have opinions, and not quite enough for those opinions to get lost. Evelyn was aware from the first week that people were talking about her, not viciously, mostly, but in the constant low-level way of a small settlement where new people were both necessary and suspicious. She went into town twice in the first 2 weeks, once for supplies and once to visit the county land office to look up some records. Both times she could feel the slight hesitation in the way people addressed her, the pause before they decided how to be, the questions that formed behind polite faces. She caught pieces of conversation in the general store that stopped when she came around the corner. A woman at the land office was more direct. Her name was Ruth Alden, mid-40s, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who'd spent years watching things happen and had strong views about all of it. "You're the woman out at Walker's," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Evelyn said. "How's that going?" "Productively, I think." Ruth looked at her with open evaluation. "People are wondering about your arrangement out there." Evelyn kept her face pleasant. "I imagine they are. Cole Walker's a decent man. Lost his way a bit after Martha died. People have been waiting to see if he'd pull out of it." "I think he's pulling out of it," Evelyn said. "He's a good rancher. The accounts just needed attention." "And you're providing that attention." "I am. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of measured respect, the kind that gets extended to someone who doesn't get defensive. He doesn't make it easy. Cole, I mean. He'll take your help if he thinks it's practical, but he doesn't like owing people. I'm aware of that. She paused. He's not owing me, exactly. It's a transaction. I needed a place to land, and he needed the books looked at. Is that what it is? That's what it is. Ruth handed over the land records she'd requested without further comment. But on her way out, she paused. If you're going to be around a while, there's a town meeting Thursday evenings at the church hall. Mostly ranch business, land concerns, water disputes. Useful to know people. Evelyn thanked her and filed the information away. The Nathan Briggs letter came back positive. Cole read it at the breakfast table and said nothing for a moment, then set it down and looked out the window at the north pasture. He wants to come out and look at the land before he commits. That's reasonable, Evelyn said. She poured him more coffee. Do you want me to handle the correspondence from here? He picked up the letter again. You wrote the first one. I drafted it for you to review. I didn't change anything. No, she agreed. He set it down. You can handle it. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, but it was something. Sadie was her other education. The girl was everywhere, up early, doing chores that Evelyn was fairly sure were beyond what was reasonable for an 11-year-old, inserting herself into every conversation about the ranch with the confidence of someone who considered herself a full stakeholder, which, in every way that mattered, she was. What Evelyn began to understand slowly was the shape of what had happened to this family. Martha Walker had died of fever. Quick, Sadie said once, in the way that people describe things they haven't fully processed, like if they say it fast enough, it won't hurt as much. And Cole had gone inward afterward. Not absent exactly. He still got up every morning and worked the ranch. He still cooked sometimes, badly, and made sure Sadie got to school when she was supposed to go. But the part of him that had managed the business side, the part that had made plans and followed correspondence and kept track of things, that part had gone somewhere else. And Sadie had seen it happening and started picking up the pieces, in the imperfect way a child picks up pieces, doing what she could with what she had. You're very capable, Evelyn told her one afternoon, when they were mending fence along the east pasture and Sadie was doing it with an efficiency that made Evelyn feel slightly incompetent by comparison. Sadie shrugged. Walt showed me. That's not what I mean. The girl was quiet for a moment. Someone had to be. Evelyn kept working. She didn't say what she was thinking, that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to be. That the weight visible in the set of Sadie's shoulders, the way she watched her father from a distance with a careful attention that was more mother than child, none of it was right, even if it was understandable. What she said instead was, "You did good finding me." Sadie looked at her sideways. You think? The Briggs deal is probably going to happen. The bank letter got a response. They're at least reviewing it. Your father is talking to Mercer about options for next year, which he wasn't doing before. Evelyn pulled the wire taut. Things are moving. You started that. Sadie said nothing for a moment, then paused talking to people again. I noticed that. He is. He wasn't before. He'd go days without saying much. Evelyn didn't have a comment for that. She just kept working. Miss Harper, Sadie said, are you going to leave when it's fixed? Evelyn looked at her. The girl's face was carefully neutral, which meant she was trying hard. I don't know yet, Evelyn said. Let's get it fixed first. The town meeting was on a Thursday at the end of her second week, and Evelyn went. Cole didn't want to go. He'd been avoiding town meetings since Martha died, Walt mentioned quietly, the first time Evelyn had gotten more than 4 words out of the man. She told Cole she needed to go to understand the local land situation better, which was true, and also a way of framing it so he couldn't reasonably object. He came anyway, sat in the back row with his arms folded and his hat on, like a man attending something under mild protest. The meeting was practical stuff, mostly a dispute over a water channel between 2 ranchers, a question about road maintenance, a proposal about organizing a collective purchase for winter supplies. Ruth Alden ran it with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years. Evelyn sat toward the middle and listened. She wasn't there to speak, just to learn. But near the end, a man stood up who changed the temperature of the room in a way she noticed before she understood why. He was well-dressed for Black Ridge, not frontier well-dressed, genuinely well-dressed, with a coat that had been made to measure and boots that had never seen mud. He was maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, with a pleasant face that had the quality of being pleasant by calculation rather than nature. "Victor Blackwell," the man next to her said quietly, before she could ask. "He's been buying land in the county for the past year. Bought the Hensley spread, the old Dunn property. People think he's planning to consolidate the water rights." "To what end?" Evelyn murmured. The man shrugged. "Whatever makes him money." Blackwell was speaking about infrastructure, roads, a proposed rail spur that would come through the county if the right-of-way arrangements were made. His tone was collegial, neighborly, but Evelyn watched the room and noticed the way certain people went still when he talked, the way their expressions went careful and blank. The particular stillness of people who've learned not to react where someone can see. After the meeting, Blackwell made his way through the crowd with the ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms. He stopped to speak to 3 or 4 people, and then, at some point, he was next to Cole. She moved closer without making it obvious. "Cole," Blackwell was saying, "good to see you out. It's been a while." "Victor," Cole said, neutral. "How are things at the ranch? I heard you've had a difficult stretch." "Things are fine. Good. Good." Blackwell's smile was professional. "You know, if you ever find yourself in a bind, I've been picking up properties in the area, just consolidating my interests. If the ranch ever became more than you wanted to manage, I'd be interested in a conversation." Cole said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll keep that in mind." Blackwell moved on. Cole didn't look at Evelyn, but he moved to stand slightly closer to her as the crowd thinned around them. "He's been making that offer for 8 months, he said quietly. "Has his interest in the property changed over time?" "Gets a little more interested every quarter." Cole's jaw was set. "He knows about the loan." "How?" "Hargrove at the bank. Blackwell does business with him." Evelyn absorbed this. Banker with favorable ties to a land speculator, a failing ranch with a punishing loan, a man making quarterly inquiries about buying. It wasn't complicated. It was just ugly. "Well," she said, "that's useful to know." Cole looked at her sideways. "Is that all you've got? For right now?" She picked up her coat from the chair. "I need to think about the Mercer contract again, and I want to look more carefully at those water rights documentation." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, dry and short. "You've been here 2 weeks and you're already—" He stopped. "Already what?" "Already treating this like your problem." She looked at him directly. "It is my problem, Mr. Walker. Until it isn't." She headed for the door. After a moment, she heard him follow. By the end of the first month, 3 things had happened. Nathan Briggs had come out, looked at the north pasture, and agreed to a seasonal grazing lease that would provide steady income starting in the spring. Not a fortune, but reliable, and documented properly this time. The bank had written back about the penalty clause. They weren't agreeing to change it. That would have been too much to hope for. But their response was careful and formal, in a way that suggested they didn't want the clause examined too closely. She filed the response and noted the language. And Cole had started talking to her. Not small talk. He wasn't a small talk person. But in the evenings after dinner sometimes, when Sadie had gone up and Walt had retreated to his quarters near the barn, Cole would stay at the kitchen table with the second mug of coffee he never quite finished, and he'd ask her something. About the Mercer contract renegotiation she'd been drafting, about the water rights records, about something she'd mentioned at breakfast that he'd clearly been turning over all day. He listened carefully. He asked precise questions. He didn't defer to her exactly, but he engaged, pushed back when he disagreed, asked her to explain her reasoning when something didn't track for him. He was, she found, considerably sharper than he'd initially appeared. He'd just been applying that sharpness entirely to cattle and horses and land, and not at all to the business architecture around them. "You could learn this," she told him one evening, matter-of-factly. He looked up from the document she'd handed him. "Learn what?" "The accounts. The contracts. It's not complicated once you understand the structure." She paused. "You're not bad with numbers when you look at them. You just haven't been looking." He was quiet for a moment. Martha used to say the same thing. She didn't answer right away. She understood she was walking near something that had weight, and she moved around it carefully. "The goal isn't to need me indefinitely," she said. "The goal is for you to understand your own operation." He looked at her for a moment in a way that was hard to read. "Is that what the goal is?" She didn't answer that one. But on the last evening of the first month, Evelyn sat in the sewing room that had been Martha Walker's and looked at the quilt on the bed in the lamplight. The money from the Briggs lease would help, but wasn't enough. The bank's situation was fragile. Mercer was resistant to renegotiating, and she was going to have to find a different angle there. Blackwell was circling, and she didn't understand yet exactly what he wanted or how he was connected to the bank. And she was sleeping in a dead woman's sewing room in a town where she'd arrived as a jilted mail-order bride, working without pay for a man who barely trusted her, on behalf of a child who'd recruited her from a train station with the unsentimental pragmatism of someone twice her age. None of this was what she'd planned. She thought about Thomas Aldridge, or whoever had written those letters, and felt the familiar burn of it. Not heartbreak, she hadn't known him well enough for that, but the particular humiliation of having been played, of having arranged her life around a lie. She thought about the silver brooch she'd sold, her mother's, the one with the small blue stones. Gone now. Not coming back. She looked at the quilt, at the careful stitching, at the faded pattern that had once been bright. Someone had made this with a lot of hours and a lot of attention. It had been in this room long before Evelyn arrived and would be here after she was gone. She was tired. The kind of tired that lived behind the eyes and in the back of the shoulders. The kind that sleep didn't always fix. But there was something else, too. Underneath the tired and the uncertainty and the situation she hadn't asked for. Something she didn't quite have a name for yet. A sense of being in the right place doing the right work, even if the work was hard and the outcome uncertain. She'd been running from something when she'd bought that train ticket. She understood that now more clearly than she had then. Maybe she'd run far enough. She turned down the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. The distant low of cattle, the creak of the house, the wind moving through the grass outside the window. She didn't sleep right away. But she stayed. The Briggs lease agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table with Walt as witness, and afterward Nathan Briggs shook hands with Cole and nodded at Evelyn and drove his wagon back north toward his sheep operation without much ceremony. Cole watched him go from the porch, and Evelyn stood a few steps back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "That's something," Cole said finally. "It's a start," she said. He went back to the barn. She went back to the accounts. That was how it was between them. Practical, transactional, with a kind of cautious respect that had been earned slowly over the past month, and that neither of them pushed beyond what it was. She understood by now that Cole Walker didn't give trust easily, and she wasn't asking him to. She was asking him to let her do her work, and mostly he did. What she hadn't told him yet was that the Mercer renegotiation had hit a wall. She'd written 3 letters to Mercer Trading in Tucson, each more specific than the last, laying out the case that the current contract terms were disproportionate to market rates for the region. She'd done research, asked Ruth Alden at the land office about comparable arrangements, corresponded with a woman in Flagstaff whose husband ran a similar operation, and she had numbers to back her position. The response from Mercer had been polite, brief, and entirely unresponsive to the substance of what she'd written. They were satisfied with the current arrangement. They valued their relationship with the Walker Ranch. They looked forward to continued business. She read that 3rd letter sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and recognized it for what it was: a door closing. The Mercer contract still had 14 months to run. 14 months of giving away a cut that was too large, locked in by a clause Cole hadn't thought twice about when he'd signed it during the fog of his first year alone. She couldn't break the contract without cause. She needed to either find cause or find another angle. She was still turning that over when Sadie came in from school that afternoon and dropped her books on the table with the particular energy of a child who had news and had been holding it all day. "Damian Cross is in town," Sadie said. Evelyn looked up. "Who?" "Man who came through last spring. He runs some kind of land investment business," Walt says. But Walt also says he's not to be trusted, which Walt almost never says about anyone. Sadie sat down across from her. "He was at the general store today talking to Mr. Hewitt. I heard him mention Pa's name." Evelyn set down her pen. "What exactly did he say?" "Something about the Walker property having good water access. And then he saw me and stopped talking. Sadie's expression was carefully neutral in the way that meant she was more bothered than she was showing. He knew who I was. He said, "You must be Cole Walker's girl," and smiled in a way I didn't like. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "What did you do?" "I bought the flower Mrs. Abbott asked me to get, and I left." A pause. "Was that right?" "That was exactly right," Evelyn said. She picked up her pen, then set it back down again. "Did you hear anything else?" "He said something to Mr. Hewitt about the bank. Hargrove's name. I couldn't hear the rest." Evelyn sat with this. Hargrove at the bank. Blackwell, who'd been making quiet offers on the property for 8 months and who had a relationship with Hargrove. And now a man named Damian Cross showing up and asking about the Walker property's water access. These things might be unconnected. She didn't think they were. "Don't mention this to your father yet," she said. Sadie frowned. "Why not?" "Because I want to know more before I say anything. If I tell him now, he'll get his back up, and it'll be harder to find out what's actually happening." She met the girl's eyes. "Can you trust me on that for now?" Sadie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "For now," she said. Evelyn went to the town meeting that Thursday. Damian Cross was there. She recognized him from Sadie's description before anyone told her who he was. Well-dressed like Blackwell, but differently, with the kind of casual ease that came from practice rather than position. He was maybe 40, lean, with an easy smile and the habit of touching people lightly on the arm when he talked to them, the way people do when they want you to feel noticed. He was good at it. She watched him work the room for 20 minutes before Ruth Alden came to stand beside her. "You're watching Cross," Ruth said. "Is it that obvious?" "To me." Ruth kept her eyes on the front of the room where the meeting was about to start. "He came through last spring, bought a piece of land east of town, supposedly for development. Nothing's happened with it since. Now he's back." "Does he have a connection to Victor Blackwell?" Ruth was quiet for a fraction of a second too long. "People have seen them together." "Recently?" "Last week at the hotel." Ruth finally looked at her. "You're putting things together." "I'm trying to." Evelyn watched Cross laugh at something a rancher near the door had said. "What do you know about the Hargrove Bank's relationship with Blackwell?" "Enough to know it's cozy in ways it shouldn't be," Ruth said. "But knowing something and being able to do anything with it are different problems." The meeting started. Evelyn listened and watched, and when Cross spoke, briefly, about his development interests in the county, about infrastructure possibilities, she listened to the specific words he chose and the ones he avoided. He was smooth. She'd known smoother. But the smoothness itself was information. After the meeting, she was pulling on her coat when Cross appeared at her elbow. He had the smile ready before she'd even turned around. "Miss Harper," he said, "I don't think we've been introduced. Damian Cross." She shook his hand because refusing would have been conspicuous. "Mr. Cross, I've been hearing about the good work you're doing out at the Walker place." His tone was genuinely warm, which was the most dangerous kind of tone. "Cole's a good man. It's a good piece of land. I'm glad someone's helping him look after it." "He looks after it himself," she said pleasantly. "I just help with the accounts." "Of course." The smile didn't waver. "I don't suppose you've had a chance to look at the property's water rights documentation in your account work." "Fascinating piece of land, that north section especially." She looked at him with the same pleasant expression. "Not particularly fascinating to me, just figures on a page." "Right, right." He tilted his head slightly. "Well, if Cole ever wants to have a conversation about the property's future, I'd be glad to sit down with him. There are some interesting opportunities in the county right now for the right pieces of land." "I'll mention it," she said, in the tone of someone who wouldn't. She found Cole by the door, talking to Walt, who had come into town for supplies and stopped in at the meeting for reasons that were unclear, but that Evelyn suspected involved keeping an eye on things. Cole glanced at her as she came over and then, very briefly, at Cross across the room. "He talked to you," Cole said. "Not a question." "He did." "And?" "He's interested in the water rights. He's connected to Blackwell. And he's too smooth by half." She kept her voice low. "I want to look at the water rights documentation again when we get back." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I've had 3 people in the last year ask me about that north section. Blackwell twice, some lawyer from Tucson once. I didn't put it together. I'm putting it together now." She buttoned her coat. Let's go. The drive back was quiet. Walt drove the wagon, Evelyn sat in the back, and Cole rode alongside on his horse, which was its own conversation. He was thinking she'd learned to read that in him, working through something methodically the way he worked through a problem with a fence or a sick animal. When they got back and Sadie was in bed, Cole brought the water rights file to the table without being asked. Evelyn went through it carefully, page by page, and he sat across from her and waited. Your water rights are registered, she said after a while. They're solid. But look here. She turned a document toward him. This registration is for the well and the creek access along the south and east boundaries. The north section, the part Briggs is leasing for grazing, the water access there is registered differently. It's tied to the main registration, but the language is... She read it again. It's less precise than it should be. Cole leaned forward to look. What does that mean? It means someone with legal resources and a bad faith argument might try to claim it's ambiguous, that the north section water access isn't definitively covered under your main rights. She sat back. They probably can't win that argument if you fight it properly, but fighting it costs money. And if someone filed that claim while you're already stretched thin with the bank situation, they'd be betting I can't afford to defend it, Cole said. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark distance and then went silent. That's what they're doing, he said. They're waiting for the bank to push me to the edge, and then they're going to challenge the water rights and bet I fold. That's what it looks like to me. She met his eyes. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. His expression was hard to read. Not anger exactly, more the tight, controlled look of a man deciding something. What do we do? We get the water rights language cleaned up before anyone files anything. That means a lawyer, a good one, which costs money we don't have much of right now, but it's cheaper than defending a challenge. She tapped the document. And we need to document everything. Blackwell's conversations with you, Cross's conversation tonight, the timing of all of it. Not because we're going to court tomorrow, but because if this escalates, we want a record. You think it'll escalate? I think men like Blackwell don't circle something for 8 months and then give up, she said. I think they're patient because they can afford to be patient. Cole nodded slowly. He reached out and pulled the water rights document toward him and read it himself, carefully, the way he'd started reading documents since Evelyn had been around. Actually reading, not glancing. I know a lawyer in Prescott, Robert Vane. He handled some things for my father years ago. He's good. Can he be trusted not to talk to Hargrove's people? Yes. He said it without hesitation. He's not that kind. Write to him this week. I'll write tomorrow. He set the document down. Then, unexpectedly, I should have paid more attention to all of this years ago. She didn't agree or disagree because neither would have been useful. What she said was, you were managing what you could with what you had. Now we're managing it differently. He looked at her. In the lamplight, the kitchen felt smaller than it was. The kind of intimacy that came from sitting across a table from someone late at night working through a problem that mattered to both of you. You keep saying we, he said. Do I? Like you're in this. She held his gaze. I'm in this. He nodded once, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, but opened, like a door moved a few inches by the wind. Then he picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, and got up to set it in the basin. Get some sleep, he said. We've got an early morning. She sat at the table for a few minutes after he'd gone up, listening to the ranch settle. Then she put the water rights file back in order and went to bed. The letter to Robert Vane went out the next day. Cole wrote it himself. 3 days later, Evelyn found the Mercer angle. It came from an unlikely source, Walt. She'd been doing a slow, methodical review of every invoice and receipt in the ranch's records, going back 4 years, and she'd come across a discrepancy she hadn't noticed before. A series of weights listed on the Mercer receipts for cattle sold that didn't match the figures Walt had recorded in his own rough ledger, which he kept in a small notebook in his vest pocket, and which she'd had to ask to see twice before he'd shown her. The difference wasn't enormous in any single transaction. Across 2 years, it added up to something significant. She brought the 2 records to the kitchen table and compared them side by side, and then went to find Walt in the barn. He was mending a piece of harness with the focused patience of someone who'd been doing that particular task for 40 years. Walt, she said, These figures from Mercer in the fall of last year. I have the weights they recorded as 2,812 pounds for that shipment. Your notebook says 3,140. Walt put down the harness. He looked at the numbers she'd written on the paper. His face did something complicated. I wrote down what I counted, he said. I believe you. She sat down on a hay bale. Did you ever raise this with Mercer or with Cole? I told Cole once, early on, when it first happened. He said maybe I miscounted. Walt's voice was carefully flat. I didn't miscount. No, she agreed. I don't think you did. She looked at the numbers again. This is a pattern, Walt. Same discrepancy, same direction, consistently over multiple shipments. Someone at Mercer is either recording wrong weights deliberately or they're working a scale that's been adjusted. Walt pulled the harness back into his hands and worked the needle through without looking at her. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to document it properly, and I'm going to write a very specific letter to Mercer that makes it clear we've noticed. She paused. And I'm going to copy Robert Vane on it, once we've established him as our legal contact, because having a lawyer's name on correspondence changes the nature of the conversation. Walt said nothing for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man who'd been waiting for someone to do exactly this, Cole's going to be angry that it went on this long. He might be, she said, but it didn't go on because anyone was careless. It went on because you told him once and he was in no state to act on it. That's different from not caring. Walt glanced at her sideways. You're all right, Miss Harper. It was, she suspected, Altipex. About the highest compliment Walt gave anyone. She took it. Cole's reaction when she showed him was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the quiet, controlled stillness of a man who'd been wronged over a long period of time and was processing the fact that he'd missed it. He sat at the table and looked at the two sets of figures for a long time. 2 years, he said. At least 2 years of records we have, possibly before. How much, total? She told him. His jaw tightened. I can't sue them, he said. Not now, not with everything else. You don't need to sue them. You need to make them aware that you know, and that you have documentation, and that you have legal representation. 9 times out of 10, the threat of scrutiny is enough to change behavior. They'll start recording correctly. She looked at him. And it gives you leverage on the renegotiation. They'll be more willing to discuss revised terms when they know you have this in your back pocket. He looked at her for a long moment. You thought of all this. I had time to think. She allowed herself a small, dry smile. The accounts keep me busy, but not that busy. His mouth twitched slightly. It wasn't much, but for Cole Walker, it was something close to a laugh. The Mercer letter went out with the next post, on the same day as the letter to Robert Vane. The week that followed was quieter than any they'd had since Evelyn arrived, which she didn't entirely trust. Quiet on a ranch meant something was either going well or building. She kept working through the accounts, kept tracking the expenses against the income, kept updating the projections toward the end-of-year payment date, which was 12 weeks away. The Briggs lease income would help. The Mercer correction, if it held, would help. But the gap between what they had and what they needed was still real, and she turned it over every morning with her first cup of coffee like a stone. She kept picking up to check what was under it. One afternoon, she was in the east pasture with Sadie, checking the fence line. Sadie had made it her personal project to teach Evelyn how to properly assess and repair fence, which she approached with the patience of a teacher who has accepted that her student is slow but willing. When Cole rode up, he didn't usually come to find her during the day. She looked at his expression and put down the fence tool. What happened? She said. Hargrove called in a meeting. He dismounted. His face was controlled, but she'd learned to read the tension in the way he held his shoulders. Wants me in at the bank tomorrow morning. Says it's about the end-of-year payment schedule. Did he say anything else? Said there were some questions about the property valuation, that Mercer had raised some concerns. Cole's voice was even, but his eyes were not. I think they know I talked to Vane. Evelyn absorbed this. The speed of it surprised her, which meant she'd underestimated how tightly connected these people were. Hargrove and Mercer in contact, Mercer responding to her letter not by correcting behavior, but by escalating to the bank. It was a coordinated response, which meant it was more organized than she'd thought. I'm coming with you, she said. Evelyn, I'm coming with you. She said it the same way, not louder, not harder, just the same. You need someone who's read every word of that loan agreement sitting in that room with you. He looked at her for a moment. She saw him decide, not gladly, but practically. Fine, he said. Sadie had been listening from 3 feet away with the stillness of a child trying to be invisible. I want to come too, she said. No, Cole and Evelyn said at the same time. Sadie's expression flickered. I could wait outside. You'll wait here, Cole said. His voice was firm but not unkind. Walt needs help with the horses this afternoon anyway. Walt doesn't need help with anything, Sadie said accurately. Sadie, just her name, the way he said it when he needed her to hear him and not argue. She heard him. She went back to examining the fence with an energy that communicated her feelings without voicing them. Cole looked at Evelyn. 8 o'clock tomorrow. I'll be ready. The bank was a squat brick building on Black Ridge's main street, between the hardware store and the post office. Hargrove's office was in the back. A small room with a large desk, 2 chairs facing it, and the kind of careful neatness that said the person who occupied it liked control. Hargrove was a man in his late 50s, thin, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on as if he couldn't decide whether he needed them. He was polite in the smooth, professional way of someone who delivered bad news regularly and had learned to do it without raising his voice. He did not look pleased to see Evelyn. Mr. Walker, he said, I wasn't aware you were bringing— Miss Harper manages the Walker ranch accounts, Cole said, sitting down without waiting to be invited. Evelyn sat beside him. She's aware of everything relevant to our loan situation. Hargrove put his glasses on and looked at some papers on his desk. I see. Well, I've asked you in because some concerns have come to our attention about the property valuation as it relates to the collateral on your loan. He placed one hand on the papers in the flat way of a man presenting a done deal. We've received information suggesting the water rights on the northern section may be less clear than previously understood. This affects our assessment of the collateral's value. Evelyn spoke before Cole could. What information specifically, and from what source? Hargrove looked at her over his glasses. I'm not at liberty to— Mr. Hargrove, she said pleasantly, the loan agreement Mr. Walker signed specifies the collateral as the Walker Ranch property in its entirety, with water rights as documented at signing. If your bank is now claiming a portion of those rights is unclear, that's a material change to the basis of the original agreement, and we'd need to understand where that claim originates. She paused. Our legal counsel will certainly want to know. The words legal counsel had an effect. Small, but visible. Hargrove's hand moved slightly on the papers. You have legal counsel now? Robert Vane in Prescott, Cole said. Another small shift. Hargrove knew the name. I see. He took his glasses off again. Well, the bank isn't making a formal claim at this stage. We're simply noting a potential concern that— a concern that appeared very recently and from a source you won't name at the same time that our counsel became involved, Evelyn said. I understand. She kept her voice neutral. So there's no formal reassessment of the collateral value at this time. A pause. Not at this time. And the payment schedule as originally agreed remains in effect? Another pause. Yes. Good. She folded her hands in her lap. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss? Hargrove looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had expected a different kind of conversation and was recalibrating. Just to say that the bank is invested in Mr. Walker's success, he said, with the smoothness of someone returning to a prepared script. And we're always open to conversations about alternative arrangements that work for both parties. What kind of alternative arrangements? Cole said. Well, if the property were to be sold, or if an investor were to come in with sufficient capital to address the loan balance, the bank would obviously be supportive of a transition that protected everyone's interests. Cole was very still. Thank you, Evelyn said, standing. We'll keep that in mind. Cole? He stood. She saw his hands, the way they'd tightened at his sides, and she moved slightly toward the door so he'd follow. They were outside on the main street before he said anything. They want me to sell, he said. Low, controlled. They want you to sell to whoever is pointing them in this direction, she said, which is Blackwell or Cross or both. They're squeezing. She started walking toward where they'd tied the horses. But they blinked in there. The legal counsel mentioned stop them from doing anything formal today. That buys us time. He was walking beside her, and she could feel the tension coming off him in the way it did when he was working hard not to react. It doesn't fix the end-of-year payment problem. No, she said. It doesn't. She untied her horse. Let me think about it. You keep saying that. And I keep coming up with something, she said. Give me until the end of the week. He looked at her for a moment over his horse's neck. The morning light was flat and cool, and the main street of Black Ridge went about its business around them. A wagon going past, someone sweeping a doorstep, two men talking near the hardware store. Normal things, ordinary day, while something that felt anything but ordinary was tightening around them. End of the week, he said. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the early ones. Not distance, not distrust, just two people who'd been through something together and didn't need to talk about it to know they'd both been there. Sadie was waiting on the porch when they got back. She'd been trying not to wait. Evelyn could tell by the way she was holding a book open at a random page and making a show of reading. How did it go? She asked. Fine, Cole said. He swung down from the horse and handed the reins to Walt, who had appeared as if from nowhere in the way he always did. Sadie looked at Evelyn. It went the way it was supposed to go, Evelyn said, which was true, just not complete. Go finish that chapter. I have some thinking to do. She went inside. She'd made a pot of coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pen and started writing everything down. All of it, in order, with dates. The bank meeting, the Mercer weights, the water rights language, Cross's appearance, Blackwell's months of quiet inquiries. She'd been tracking these pieces separately, and she wanted to see them together, laid out in a sequence. When she laid them out, the shape of it was clear. It was a coordinated strategy. Patient, professional, working multiple angles at once. Someone had spent real time planning this. It was designed to put Cole in a position where he had one exit, and that exit was a sale. What it assumed was that Cole had no one helping him and no legal resources and no way to document what was happening. The first two had changed. The third was still true, but documentation was something she could build. She wrote for an hour and a half. By the time Cole came in for lunch, she had 4 pages of notes in a clean sequence, and she knew what the end of the week looked like. The idea had come from the county land records she'd reviewed earlier in the month, from a small notation she'd almost missed, an old easement agreement between the Walker Ranch and a neighboring property to the east, the Caldwell place, that granted mutual water access during drought conditions. The Caldwell place had been purchased 2 years ago by a man in Tucson whose name she'd noted but not thought about until now. She thought about it now. She wrote to Robert Vane that afternoon, not Cole's letter, her own, laying out the water rights question and asking specifically about the legal standing of the easement and whether it could be used to reinforce the documentation of the North Section rights. She also wrote a shorter letter to a woman named Clara Briggs, Nathan Briggs's wife, whom she'd met briefly when Nathan had come to look at the land, who had mentioned in passing that she knew most of the landowners in the county and had lived there 30 years. She asked Clara, gently, what she knew about the Caldwell purchase and the man in Tucson. Both letters went out with Walt on the afternoon supply run. Then she made dinner and set the table and called Cole and Sadie in from wherever they were, and the three of them ate, and Sadie talked about a dispute at school that had been occupying her all week. And Cole asked 2 questions and made 1 comment, and Evelyn mostly listened and watched them. This difficult wounded man and this remarkable burdened child, and thought about easements and water rights and the particular patience required to build something one careful step at a time. You're doing it again, Sadie said at one point. Evelyn looked up. Doing what? That thing where you're here, but you're also somewhere else figuring something out. Sadie pointed her fork. Your eyes go far away. I'm here, Evelyn said. You're thinking about the bank thing. I'm thinking about the ranch, Evelyn said. That's most of the same thing. Cole looked at her over his coffee and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of thing. Then he looked at Sadie. Dishes, he said. Sadie made her feelings about this known through the angle of her exit, but she went. Cole looked back at Evelyn. End of the week, he said. End of the week, she confirmed. He nodded and went to the barn for evening check. Evelyn sat alone at the table for a few minutes after, listening to Sadie make more noise than necessary with the dishes, listening to the door of the barn open and close, listening to the wind pick up outside. The ranch breathed around her. The gap between what they had and what they needed was still real. Robert Vane hadn't written back yet. Clara Briggs hadn't written back yet. The Mercer situation was unresolved. The bank was circling. Blackwell was still out there and cross. But there was the documentation she'd built today. There was Vane in Prescott. There was Walt's notebook with its careful, honest figures. There was the Briggs lease. There was a woman in Flagstaff who'd confirmed market rates. There was the easement notation she'd almost missed. None of it was enough by itself. Together it was beginning to be something. She got up and cleared her own cup from the table and went back to the sewing room, where Martha Walker's quilt sat folded at the foot of the narrow bed. She'd taken to leaving it folded these days rather than pulling it over herself at night, a small distinction that probably meant nothing and felt like something. She lit the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her notes. End of the week. She had 4 days. She'd done more with less. Robert Vane's letter arrived on a Friday, 2 days past Evelyn's self-imposed deadline, which she'd spent trying not to count. She read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, with the lamp still burning because the October mornings had gotten dark and cold in a way that said winter wasn't politely waiting its turn. Vane wrote clearly and without unnecessary softening, which she appreciated. His assessment of the water rights language confirmed what she'd suspected. The North Section documentation was imprecise, not legally void, but imprecise enough that a well-funded challenge could force a costly defense. His recommendation was to file a clarifying amendment with the county land office before any challenge was made, which would close the gap and make a future claim significantly harder to sustain. The cost was manageable. The timing was urgent. He had also written something in the final paragraph that she read twice. He said he'd made a quiet inquiry through professional channels about the Caldwell property purchase and the Tucson buyer. The man's name was Gerald Fitch, and Fitch had a documented business relationship with Victor Blackwell going back 7 years. The Caldwell purchase, Vane believed, had been made specifically to position someone adjacent to the Walker water rights, not to use the land, but to be in a legal position to contest access to it when the time came. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and started the stove for breakfast. Cole came in from the barn at 5:30, smelling of cold air and hay, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing by the stove, still in his coat. She watched his face go through several things. Fitch, he said, connected to Blackwell for 7 years. The Caldwell purchase wasn't coincidence. No. He set the letter on the table. They've been planning this a while. Long enough to buy adjacent land and wait, she said, which means they were patient and organized. We need to be more patient and more organized. She poured him coffee. Vane wants to file the clarifying amendment as soon as possible. He needs you to authorize it and send him the original registration documents. I can do that today. There's something else. She sat down. Clara Briggs wrote back. The woman I asked about local land ownership. Cole looked at her. She says the general understanding in the county is that Blackwell wants to consolidate the northern water access from 4 or 5 properties into a single controlled corridor. Something to do with a proposed irrigation project he's been quietly promoting to investors in Phoenix. If he controls the water corridor, he controls the development rights for a significant stretch of land. She paused. Your north section sits in the middle of that corridor. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from her, heavy and deliberate. That's why he's been at it for 8 months. The ranch itself might not even be his primary interest. It's the water position. She wrapped her hands around her mug. Which means he needs you gone before he can complete the picture. Without your water rights in the corridor, the whole project has a gap in it. Cole rubbed his jaw. She could see him working through it, the same methodical way he approached everything. So our strongest move is to protect those rights and stay put. Yes, a properly documented and defended water rights position makes the corridor incomplete, which makes Blackwell's project less viable, which reduces the pressure on us. She looked at him steadily. We're not just protecting a failing ranch. We're the missing piece in someone else's plan. That's actually a stronger position than I thought we were in 2 weeks ago. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. Not warmly, but with the dry, controlled expression of a man who found something darkly satisfying in the situation. You've turned this around. I've understood it better, she said carefully. There's a difference. Sadie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, hair completely undone from last night's braid, squinting against the lamp. "Are you two doing the ranch thing again?" "Go get dressed," Cole said. "It's before 6. "School doesn't wait," he said. Sadie retreated with the energy of someone who was profoundly unconvinced by this logic. The documents went to Vane by the end of the week, along with a letter from Cole authorizing the amendment filing. Evelyn spent the following days doing two things simultaneously, continuing to build the documentary record, dates, names, the sequence of events in careful order, and watching the situation with Mercer. Mercer's response to her letter about the weights had finally come in, 8 days after she'd sent it. The letter was 2 paragraphs, formally worded, explaining that the weights had been recorded in accordance with standard practice and expressing confidence in their measurement processes. There was no acknowledgement of the discrepancy and no offer to address it. She read it twice, then put it in the file. "They're not going to fix it voluntarily," she told Cole that evening. "I didn't think they would. But they also didn't threaten us, which means they're not sure how exposed they are." She looked at the file. Vane is the right next step here, too. If he puts their weighing practices in the context of a broader legal review of the contract, they'll recalculate. "We're spending a lot on Vane." "We are," she agreed. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "But we're spending it to protect something worth considerably more than the legal fees." Cole nodded. He didn't like it. She could see that. The instinct of a man who'd run lean for years and was uncomfortable with costs, even necessary ones, but he didn't argue. The shift when it came was not subtle. It started with the cattle. On a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the bank meeting, Walt came to the house before breakfast with an expression Evelyn had not seen on him before. Not the flat neutral of his daily manner, but something tight and controlled. The look of a man delivering news he wishes he wasn't delivering. "3 head down in the south pasture," he said. "Sick. Same signs as what went through 2 years ago." Cole was on his feet before Walt finished speaking. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and listened to them move fast through the yard, and she stayed where she was because there was nothing she could do about sick cattle, and she knew it. Sadie appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at her. "How bad?" Sadie said. "I don't know yet." It was bad. Not catastrophic. Cole and Walt contained it within 2 days, isolated the affected animals, identified the likely source as contaminated water in a trough near the south fence that had somehow gone stagnant. 3 animals were seriously ill and wouldn't recover quickly enough to make the spring sale. 2 others were borderline. Cole came in on the second evening with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running on adrenaline and was now facing the arithmetic. He sat at the table and Evelyn set food in front of him and sat across. "You need to eat something," she said. He ate, mechanically. Then, "That's 3 animals we can't count on for the spring sale." "I know. It changes the numbers. I've already adjusted the projections." She'd spent the afternoon doing exactly that, running the new figures against the end-of-year payment date. "We're tighter than we were, but we're not under." He looked up. "The Briggs lease income covers more than I'd originally projected because Nathan added the secondary grazing section. Vane's fees are less than I budgeted because he's billing us at a reduced rate." She saw Cole's expression. "I didn't ask him to do that. He offered it, and I accepted it because it was practical. The adjusted numbers are still workable. Not comfortable, but workable." "You adjusted them this afternoon." "I adjust them every time something changes," she said. "That's the point." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something in his face that was not gratitude exactly. He didn't give gratitude easily, she'd learned that, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who keeps expecting to be alone with a problem and keeps finding he isn't. "The trough," she said, "the contaminated one." "What about it?" "Did it contaminate itself or did someone help it along?" The silence that followed was very deliberate. "I don't know," Cole said finally, each word careful. "Can you find out?" Walt checked the fence line. "There's a section near the south boundary that's been disturbed. Could have been deer, could have been something else." He stopped. "The trough isn't accessible from the road. Someone would have had to come onto the property." Evelyn kept her voice even. "I think you should mention that to Vane." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You think this wasn't an accident?" "I think it's convenient timing," she said. "The bank meeting, the Mercer letter, Vane's involvement, and then 3 weeks later, sick cattle and a disturbed fence line. She met his eyes. I might be wrong. You haven't been wrong about much. She didn't answer that. She cleared the plates from the table and went to add the incident to the documentation file, dated and described in precise, unemotional language. The kind of language that would matter if it was ever read by someone making a judgment. Then things got worse. It was a Wednesday, about 10 days after the cattle incident, when Evelyn came back from town to find a man sitting on the porch of the Walker house. Not waiting nervously, not respectfully, but sitting in one of Cole's chairs with the ease of someone who considered himself welcome everywhere he went. Damien Cross. He stood when he saw her ride in, and the smile came on with the fluid reliability of a faucet. Miss Harper, he said, I was hoping to catch Cole. He's out on the north pasture, she said. She didn't dismount immediately. Was he expecting you? I thought I'd stop by informally, neighborly. The smile didn't shift. I have a proposal I wanted to run past him, something that might take some pressure off the current situation. She dismounted then because staying on the horse was a choice she didn't want to make visible. She tied her horse to the post and walked to the porch steps and stopped. You can tell me, she said. I manage the accounts. Cross tilted his head slightly, assessing. This is more of a broader business discussion. The broader business discussion will still come through me, she said. What's the proposal? A beat. The smile adjusted almost imperceptibly. Still there, but recalculated. I represent a group of investors who have significant interest in the county's water infrastructure development. Walker's north section is a key piece of a larger opportunity. We'd like to make a formal offer on the property. A fair offer, above current market value, structured to address the outstanding bank loan and leave Cole in a solid financial position. She looked at him. And in exchange, you'd control the north section water rights. In exchange, Cole gets to walk away from a difficult situation with money in his pocket, rather than debt around his neck. Walk away from his home, she said. From a failing operation, Cross said pleasantly. She'd heard the word failing used about this ranch more times in the past weeks than she could count. Each time it landed differently. This time it landed like something she was done tolerating. The ranch isn't failing, she said. It's had a difficult period that's being addressed, and Mr. Walker isn't interested in selling. She met Cross's eyes with the particular stillness of someone who's finished being polite and hasn't yet decided what comes next. If your investors want to submit a formal written offer, they can do that through Robert Vane in Prescott, who handles our legal matters. Otherwise, I'd ask you not to come to the property unannounced. Cross looked at her for a moment. The smile was still there, but it had changed quality. Thinner, less warm. You should be careful about the advice you're giving him, he said. It would be unfortunate if this situation got more complicated for everyone. She didn't blink. Good afternoon, Mr. Cross. He left. She stood on the porch until his horse was out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of sitting very still with her hands flat on the table surface, feeling the grain of the wood, breathing evenly. Then she got up and started writing. Cole came in 2 hours later and she told him everything in sequence, starting with Cross on the porch and ending with the specific words more complicated for everyone. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. Cole stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He threatened you, he said. He implied consequences. I wouldn't call it a direct threat. I would. His voice had gone to the flat, controlled register that she'd learned meant he was managing something significant underneath it. He looked at the door, then back at her. He came here when you were alone. Walt was here, and I handled it. I know you handled it. He said it quickly, and it wasn't dismissive. It was something closer to acknowledgement. I'm saying he chose the timing deliberately. She hadn't quite framed it that way, but he was right. Yes, she said. He did. He was testing something. What you'd do, maybe, whether I'd fold, whether I'd tell you, what the response looked like. She looked at her notes. He's going to report back to Blackwell that there's a woman managing the accounts who isn't easily moved. Blackwell will adjust accordingly. Cole looked at her for a moment. Are you worried? She considered the question honestly. I'm alert, she said. That's different from worried. He nodded once and went to wash up for dinner. She added Cross's visit to the documentation file and underlined the date. That night, after Sadie was in bed, Cole came back to the kitchen table. She was still working, refining the end-of-year payment projections with the new cattle numbers, and he sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. "Tell me again what the numbers look like," he said. "The real ones. Not the version where everything goes right." She put down the pen. She looked at the papers in front of her. Then she told him, clearly and without softening, the gap that remained, the assumptions that had to hold, the things that could go wrong and what they would do to the margin. She didn't make it sound better than it was. She didn't make it sound worse either. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both precise. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him across the table, at this man who was not easy and had not pretended to be, who had taken 2 years of grief and accumulated damage and was sitting across from her asking what he could do, not telling her what he thought, not second-guessing her, just asking. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said. "The ranch operation is solid. You know this land? I need you focused on that while I focus on the business end." She paused. "And if Blackwell or Cross approach you directly, don't engage without me present." He nodded. "And Cole," she said. "The fence line that was disturbed near the south trough. I want Walt to start walking the perimeter every evening, not ostentatiously, just as part of the routine." He looked at her. "You think they'll try something else?" "I think men who've planned this carefully don't stop at sick cattle," she said. "I think they escalate." She was right. The fire started on a Thursday night, 2.5 weeks later, at something past midnight. Evelyn woke to the smell first, sharp and wrong, the particular smell of wood burning that didn't belong to the kitchen stove, and she was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious of moving. The barn was on fire, not smoldering, not starting. Already fully engaged on the west wall, flames up past the roofline and climbing, with the sound that fire makes when it's found enough air to run, a low roar, almost rhythmic, that she felt in her chest before she heard it clearly. She was out of the room and down the stairs shouting Cole's name before she'd thought about it. He appeared at the top of the stairs and saw her face and was past her in 2 seconds. She heard him hit the porch and start shouting for Walt, and she went back for her boots because she was not going out there barefoot, and it took her 15 seconds to put them on, and those 15 seconds felt like much longer. Outside, the night was lit by the fire in a way that made everything look theatrical and wrong. The yard bright orange on one side and pitch dark on the other, the shadows moving as the flames moved, the heat reaching her 20 feet from the barn wall. The horses were screaming. Cole and Walt were already at the barn door. The west wall was gone, but the main door on the east side was not yet burning, and Walt had a wet cloth over his face. She didn't know where it had come from, and he went through the door with Cole right behind him. Evelyn ran to the water trough by the corral, grabbed the bucket hanging on the post, and started doing the only thing that made practical sense at that moment, which was getting water on anything she could reach. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, but doing nothing was not an option she was capable of. Sadie appeared behind her. She was dressed, which meant she'd been awake or had moved faster than seemed possible, and she had her face set in the hard, frightened way of a child who has seen enough bad things to know that panicking doesn't help. "Tell me what to do," Sadie said. "Other bucket, east side of the trough. Wet down the fence post near the barn so it doesn't spread to the corral." Evelyn kept moving. "Don't go near the west wall." Sadie went without another word. Cole came out of the barn with 2 horses, one in each hand, both terrified, fighting against the lead ropes, and he got them 10 feet from the door and turned to Evelyn. "Evelyn, take them." She dropped the bucket and took the lead ropes. The horses pulled hard against her, and she planted her feet and held them, talking to them in a low, continuous voice. Not words exactly, just sound, steady and even. Because horses felt steadiness even when they couldn't be reasoned with. They pulled, and she held, and she kept talking. Cole went back in. Walt came out with a 3rd horse and 2 of the cattle that had been penned in the far stall. He handed the cattle off to Sadie somehow and got the horse to the far side of the corral. Cole came back out with the last 2 horses and something else. A box, the ranch's strong box from the tack room, which he'd somehow managed to carry out while managing a panicking horse. The west wall came down about 10 minutes after that. The sound was enormous and brief, and the fire flared and then began to settle into the pattern of something that had found its limit. The east side of the barn, the part where the animals had been, was standing but burning at the edges. They stood in the yard and watched it go. Walt had a burn on his left forearm, cloth-wrapped with the torn piece of his shirt. Cole had a burn on his hand, less serious. Evelyn's hair had gotten singed on one side, she realized when she touched it, but she'd been far enough back. Sadie was uninjured and was standing very close to Cole in a way that she probably wasn't aware of. Nobody said anything for a while. The fire took a long time to say what it was going to say. Then Cole spoke. His voice was quiet and completely flat. "That's arson." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You can't prove it yet," Walt said. "I don't need to prove it tonight," Evelyn said, "but I need to document it. Tomorrow morning, before anything is touched, I need to walk that site with you and note everything." She looked at Cole. "Both of you." Cole nodded. He was looking at the ruin of the west wall, at the barn he'd built with his father 20 years ago, and his face was doing something she couldn't entirely read, loss and anger in a proportion she couldn't measure. Sadie's hand found his. He didn't look down at her, but his hand closed around hers. "The animals are out," Evelyn said, "not because they needed to be told, but because sometimes the accounting of what you didn't lose matters as much as what you did. The horses are unhurt. You got the strong box. The cattle are—" "I know," Cole said, quietly, not cutting her off, just saying he knew. She stopped. They stood there together in the orange dark yard while the barn finished burning, the four of them. The man, the child, the hired hand, and the woman who had come here with a traveling case, and nothing else. And the fire did what fires do, which is take things and not give them back. Evelyn looked at Cole's profile in the firelight. He was not a man who fell apart, and she had known that from the first week. But this was a different kind of weight than the loan or the bank or the legal maneuvering. This was his barn, his father's barn, and it was gone, and someone had done it deliberately, and she could see in the set of his jaw that he was running the same calculation she was running. They had tried to frighten them into selling. They had failed. She looked at the documentation file in her head, the dates, the names, the sequence of events she'd been building for weeks. It was more important now than it had ever been. And she thought about Vane in Prescott, about Ruth Alden and her 30 years of watching things in this county, about Nathan Briggs and his sheep operation and his decent, practical handshake. Cross and Blackwell had made a calculation tonight. They'd calculated that destroying the barn would break something: Cole's resolve, Evelyn's willingness to stay, the ranch's ability to survive. She looked at the fire and felt something settle in her chest that was not comfort and not anger, but something with the same qualities as determination. The kind that doesn't announce itself or heat up quickly, just sits there, patient and absolute. They were wrong, she thought. They had miscalculated. She turned to Cole. "We should try to sleep a few hours. We'll need to be clear-headed in the morning." He looked at her. In the firelight, his eyes were very dark and very tired. "Yeah," he said. He didn't move for another minute, still watching the barn. Then he looked down at Sadie. "Come on," he said. "Inside." Sadie went without argument. That, more than anything, was how Evelyn knew how frightened the girl had been. Sadie Walker always had an argument. Tonight she just went. Walt stayed to keep watch on the embers. Cole touched his shoulder once as he passed. No words, just the contact. And Walt nodded. Evelyn went to her room and changed out of her smoke-soaked clothes and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were shaking, she noticed with a kind of clinical detachment. Not badly, just the delayed response of a body that had been in an emergency and was now in the process of standing down. She let them shake. There was no use fighting it. After a few minutes, she picked up her pen and began to write. The date, the time she woke, the smell, the sequence of events, Walt's injury, Cole's hand, the location of the fire's origin on the west wall, everything in order while it was still sharp. She wrote until her hand steadied. Then she put the pen down and lay back and looked at the ceiling in the dark and let herself feel, briefly, the full weight of what tonight had been. Someone had stood in the dark and lit this ranch on fire to force a family out. She thought about Sadie's hand finding coals in the yard. She thought about Walt going through a burning barn door with a wet cloth over his face because those were his horses and his people. She thought about Cole coming out with the strongbox, the thing that held the papers, the documents she'd been building for months. He'd known, in the middle of everything, what to carry. She lay there for a long time. Then she made herself stop feeling it and start thinking about what came next. Because they'd tried to break this ranch tonight, and she was not finished. The morning after the fire, Evelyn was at the barn site before sunrise. She walked the perimeter of the ruins slowly, noting everything in her journal. The origin point of the burn on the west wall's exterior base, which told her the fire had been set from outside, not from within. The pattern of the char, heaviest low and spreading upward in two distinct columns, suggesting two separate ignition points. A faint smell beneath the smoke that she couldn't name precisely, but that Walt, who came to stand beside her without being asked, identified immediately. Coal oil, he said. She wrote it down. They found the evidence of entry along the south fence line, the same section that had been disturbed weeks earlier during the cattle incident. The ground was hard, but not hard enough. There were boot prints, 2 sets, coming in from the road and going back the same way. Walt crouched over them with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 50 years reading ground, and said without looking up, 2 men, one heavier than the other. They came in fast and left faster. She wrote that down too. Cole documented it with her. He walked the site and answered her questions in a flat, precise voice, pointing out what he knew about the barn's construction, where the coal oil would have been most effective, what the pattern of the burn suggested about timing. He was useful and steady, and she could see what it was costing him to be both of those things. By mid-morning, when the site documentation was as complete as she could make it without a professional investigator, she gathered everything she had. Her notes, Walt's observations, the measurements she'd taken, and added it to the file she'd been building since the first week. The file had started as a simple account record. It was now something considerably more substantial. She sent it all to Robert Vane by express post that afternoon, with a letter asking him to pursue every available legal avenue regarding the fire and to escalate the water rights matter to urgent status. She also sent a letter to Sheriff Tom Greer. She'd met Greer once, briefly, at a town meeting, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who said little and watched everything with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that most of what people said in public meetings wasn't the thing they actually needed to talk about. She didn't know where he stood on Blackwell, didn't know if their relationship was straightforward or complicated. But she sent the letter because not sending it would be a choice too, and she wanted a record that she'd done it. Greer came out to the ranch 2 days later. He walked the site with Cole and Walt while Evelyn watched from a distance. Not because she'd been excluded, but because she'd made the calculation that Greer would talk more openly to Cole without her present. She watched the 3 of them move through the ruin, and she watched Greer's face, which was hard to read but not unreadable. He asked questions. He crouched over the boot prints. He spent a long time at the west wall base. When he came to find her afterward, his expression was careful. "You documented this thoroughly," he said, looking at the copy of her notes she'd prepared for him. "I had the materials," she said. "The coal oil conclusion. That yours or Walt's?" "Walt's identification, my documentation." He nodded slowly. "I've been watching certain activities in this county for a while," he said, and he said it in the deliberate way of someone choosing exactly how much to say. "This is the first time I've had something documented." "Is that useful?" she asked. "It's very useful." He folded the notes carefully. "I can't make an arrest on this yet. I want to be honest with you about that. What I can do is open an investigation which puts certain people on notice that their activities are being looked at officially." He paused. "It changes the calculation for them." "Yes," she said. "It does." He looked at her for a moment with a frank assessment that reminded her a little of Ruth Alden. "You've been here, what, 2 months?" "About that." "Cole's lucky you ended up here." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment exactly, just an observation. "I needed to land somewhere," she said. He left with the documentation and a promise to be in touch with Vane. She watched his horse go down the road and felt the particular satisfaction of something in motion that couldn't be easily stopped. The community response to the fire, when it came, surprised her. She hadn't anticipated it. She'd been so focused on the legal and financial architecture, the documents, the letters, the careful building of a defensive position, that she'd been thinking of this as a contained problem, the Walkers and Blackwell and the law, and she'd underestimated the way a community responds to something visible and wrong. The barn burning was visible, Everyone in Black Ridge could see the smoke column from town, and people had been watching Blackwell's land consolidation for a year, watching quietly, with the patient unease of people who sensed something moving in their direction and hadn't yet found a way to push back. The walkers gave them away. Ruth Alden was the first. She arrived 2 days after Greer's visit, without announcement, in a wagon that had 3 other women in it, the wife of one of the neighboring ranchers, a woman who ran the general store, and Clara Briggs, who had driven 30 miles. They came with tools and food and a lumber assessment that Clara's husband had put together from memory of the barn's original dimensions. Ruth said, "Tell us what you need and we'll organize it," and she said it to Evelyn, which Evelyn registered but didn't remark on. What followed was several days of organized, imperfect, genuinely moving collective effort that Evelyn hadn't known how to ask for and wouldn't have thought to ask for. Nathan Briggs came with 2 of his hands. A rancher named Tom Aldred, whose name was unfortunately close to the man who didn't exist, brought timber from his own supply. Walt's cousin, who nobody had known existed until he appeared driving a wagon load of tools, turned out to be an excellent framer. Cole worked alongside all of them, methodical and quiet, and she watched him talk to his neighbors with an ease she hadn't seen in him before. Real conversation, not the guarded exchanges he'd been managing since she arrived. Something had loosened in him. Whether it was the fire or the response to it or something in between, she couldn't say. She cooked and organized and ran 3 conversations simultaneously and kept the documentation work going in the evenings, and she was tired in the specific way of someone doing more than they should and finding they can anyway. On the 3rd day of the rebuild, Sadie came to stand beside her and watched the frame of the new barn going up against the autumn sky. "Is this going to work?" Sadie said. "The barn?" "All of it." The girl was quiet for a moment. "The legal stuff, the bank, whether they leave us alone." Evelyn looked at the frame. "I think so. I'm not promising." "That's the most honest answer you've given me." "I try to be honest with you." Sadie shifted her weight. "Pa's different lately. Better, I think, but different." "Different how?" "He talks more. Not just to you, to the neighbors, to Walt. He's been like this before, when I was really little, before things got hard." She paused. "He's more like himself." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She watched Cole across the yard laughing at something Nathan Briggs had said. A real laugh, short and genuine, unexpected on his face. "That's a good thing," she said. "I know." Sadie looked at her sideways. "Are you staying, after it's fixed?" "You asked me that before. I'm asking again." Evelyn looked at the barn frame, at the activity around it, at this community that had shown up because something was worth showing up for. "I don't have anywhere I need to be," she said finally. Sadie seemed to find this satisfactory. She went to help Walt with something, leaving Evelyn with the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh-cut timber. Robert Vane arrived in person on a Friday in the 2nd week of November, which was not what she'd expected when she'd sent him the latest round of documentation. He was a compact, precise man in his 60s with the economy of movement of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste energy on anything that didn't matter. He had correspondence she hadn't seen, including responses to inquiries she hadn't known he'd made, and he set it all on the kitchen table with the manner of someone laying a hand of cards. "The Water Rights Amendment has been filed," he said. "It's clean. Legally, it closes the gap you identified. Any challenge now would be facing a properly documented claim, and anyone who knew anything about property law would advise against it." "Good," Cole said. "Mercer." Vane looked at his notes. "They're willing to discuss a revised contract. My letter about the weighing discrepancies appears to have been persuasive." The dry tone suggested he found this unsurprising. "I've proposed terms closer to regional standard. They haven't accepted yet, but they haven't walked away either. I expect a response within 2 weeks." Evelyn absorbed this. 2 months ago, she'd been looking at an immovable contract with 14 months to run. What changed their position? The documentation of the discrepancy, the legal letterhead, and the awareness that we weren't going away. Vane looked at her. "The weight of what you've assembled here is considerable. It tells a story. Judges and juries and business people who don't want to be involved in litigation respond to a story they can follow." Cole looked at the table. "The barn." "The arson documentation is the most significant piece," Vane said. "Greer's investigation has identified a person of interest, I'm not at liberty to share more than that yet, but the investigation is active and the connection to broader interests in the county is being examined. The room was quiet for a moment. What about the end-of-year payment? Evelyn asked. Vane looked at his notes again. I filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Banking Oversight Office regarding the penalty clause, specifically regarding whether it was adequately disclosed at signing. He looked at Cole. You don't remember it being explained to you? No, Cole said. The loan officer who handled your signing, a man named Pruitt, left the bank 8 months ago under circumstances the bank has been unwilling to specify. That's interesting, from a legal perspective. Evelyn looked at Cole. He was expressionless, but his hands were flat on the table, which meant he was working to keep them that way. What does the complaint do? She asked. It doesn't void the loan, but it creates regulatory scrutiny that Hargrove's bank does not want right now, given the active investigation into the arson. The bank is currently very motivated to avoid additional attention. Vane paused. I've been in correspondence with Hargrove's office. They are willing to discuss restructuring the end-of-year payment into installments spread over the following 2 quarters, at the original interest rate, without penalty. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. They're giving ground, Evelyn said. They're recognizing the position has changed, Vane said. Whether that's principle or self-preservation is not something I'd venture a guess on. Cole's jaw worked slightly. What do we need to do? Accept the restructuring offer in writing, formally. I've drafted the acceptance letter. You sign it, I file it, and the immediate foreclosure threat is resolved. Vane set the letter on the table. I won't pretend it's everything. The loan is still there. The restructuring gives you 2 additional quarters to build toward full repayment, but it stops the clock. Cole picked up the letter and read it. He read it the way he'd learned to read documents, carefully, all of it, not just the surface. It took him several minutes. Then he picked up the pen on the table and signed it. Vane took it back and folded it into his bag with the precision of a man who had done this 10,000 times. There's one more thing, he said. He pulled out a separate document, thinner than the others. The Caldwell easement. Gerald Fitch's position on that property was designed to facilitate a legal challenge to your north section water access. With the amendment now filed, that position is substantially weakened. However, Fitch has been in contact with Blackwell's legal office about alternate approaches. Such as, Evelyn said, a nuisance claim, arguing that your ranch operations affect the value of the Caldwell property in ways that require compensation. It's a weak claim, frankly, but weak claims still cost money to defend, and they cause delays. He looked at her. I wanted you to be aware of it as a possibility. She filed it in her mind. How much notice would we have? Enough, he said. I'm watching for it. After Vane left, Cole and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of people who have just seen a weight shift. The payment restructuring, Cole said. That's real. It's real. You did that. Vane did it. I gave him the material to work with. He looked at her steadily. Don't do that. Do what? Give it away. His voice was even. You built that file. You kept the records. You found the Briggs deal and the Mercer discrepancy and the easement notation. You wrote to Vane and Greer and Clara Briggs. You stood on my porch and told Cross to come back through legal channels. He paused. That's not Vane. That's you. She looked back at him. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her in 2 months, and she wasn't sure what to do with it, so she just let it be there. We're not done, she said. I know that. Cross and Blackwell, they haven't stopped. The nuisance claim Vane mentioned, whatever else they try, I know, Cole said again. I'm not saying we're done. I'm saying what you did matters. He looked down at the table and then back at her. I'm not good at saying that kind of thing. I know I'm not, but I wanted to say it while I was thinking it instead of not saying it. She was quiet for a moment, then, thank you. They sat together for a while longer, not talking, the way people sometimes do when the talking has done what it needs to do. 3 days later, Cross made his final move. It came through legal channels, as she'd told him it should, and it arrived in the form of a document filed with the county courthouse. A claim that Evelyn Harper had entered into a fraudulent domestic arrangement at the Walker Ranch for the purpose of gaining control of the property, and that as a party with demonstrated prior association with Miss Harper, Damian Cross was petitioning the court for her removal from the premises and an examination of any legal agreements made during her tenure. She read it standing in the post office where Vane's forwarded copy had arrived, and she was aware of people around her even though she was trying not to be, and she kept her face very still. Prior association. It was a lie, a completely fabricated claim, but it was the kind of lie that required her to prove a negative, to demonstrate that she and Cross had no prior connection, and in the meantime it put her physical presence at the ranch in legal question. It was also, she understood, the most direct threat he'd made, not to the property, to her right to be where she was. She rode back to the ranch with the document in her bag and told Cole when she got there. His response was not what she expected. She'd expected anger, the controlled, shoulder-set variety she knew in him. Instead, he was very still, reading the document, and then he set it on the table and was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something resolute. "He's trying to get you out," Cole said. "Yes, because without you, the documentation falls apart, or they think it does." "Possibly?" She sat down. "Vane will respond to the claim. There's no legal basis for it. Sorry. The prior association claim is fabricated, and a fabricated legal claim can be challenged as harassment. But it takes time, and in the meantime, they're betting I'll ask you to leave." Cole said it flatly. "To make it simple, less legal trouble." "That's probably the calculation, yes." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that this isn't about what's convenient for the ranch." She waited. "Marry me," he said. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and one of the horses in the temporary corral shifted and stamped. The lamp on the table made the room small. "Cole," she said carefully, "not for the legal protection, though that's real. A wife standing on her husband's property is not something Cross can challenge. And not because of what you've done for the ranch, though I'm aware of all of that." He met her eyes with the directness she'd come to expect from him, uncomfortable and genuine in equal measure. "Because I don't want you to leave. Not when this is over. Not when the legal situation is resolved. I don't want you to leave." He stopped. "I'm not good at this. I know that. I haven't done this in a long time, and I'm probably doing it wrong." "Well, Babu." She looked at him. This man who had been so careful with trust for so long that spending it felt like a physical act, who had learned to manage everything alone and was choosing not to. "You're not doing it wrong," she said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at the kitchen, at the mismatched crockery, and the stove with the trick to it, and the account spread on the table, and the chair where Sadie ate breakfast every morning with her hair not yet done. At this place that had become, in some way she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain, hers. "Yes," she said. He let out a slow breath, like he'd been holding it without knowing. "We should tell Sadie," Evelyn said. "She'll say she already knew," Cole said. "She probably did," Evelyn said. The sound that came from him was quiet and brief, but it was a laugh, a real one. Sadie's reaction was not, in fact, "I already knew." It was, after a moment of extremely focused stillness, a collision with Evelyn's midsection that Evelyn was not entirely prepared for, which nearly put them both on the kitchen floor, and a sound that was not crying and not laughing, but somewhere in the vicinity of both. Then Sadie stepped back and arranged her face and said with great dignity, "I think this is the right decision." Cole looked at Evelyn over Sadie's head, and the expression on his face was something she would keep for a long time, complicated and warm and slightly rueful and more open than she'd ever seen it. They were married the following week at the courthouse in Black Ridge, with Ruth Alden and Nathan Briggs as witnesses, and Walt standing in the back with his hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable and pleased in equal proportion. It was brief and practical and completely without ceremony, and Evelyn wore her second-best dress because her best one had smoke damage that hadn't fully washed out. It was the right kind of ceremony for the two of them. The nuisance claim arrived from Fitch the day after, which was almost impressive in its timing. Cross's petition became legally moot the moment the marriage was recorded, and Vane filed the response to both within 48 hours, with a brevity that communicated his opinion of the claims without requiring him to state it directly. Evelyn stood in the yard with Vane's response letter in her hand and looked at the new barn frame, half complete now, rising solid against the November sky. The town had rebuilt it, piece by piece, with imperfect timber and borrowed tools, and too many opinions about the best way to frame a loft. It wasn't finished. There were gaps in the walls, and the roof was going on this week if the weather held, and there'd been a disagreement between Walt's cousin and Tom Aldred about the door placement that had required Cole to intervene with the patient firmness of a man managing people who both thought they were right. The result was a barn that leaned very slightly to the right, which Walt said would settle, and which Evelyn had written into her notes as structurally adequate pending final inspection. It wasn't perfect. Neither was anything else about this situation. Not the loan, not the Mercer negotiation still in progress, not the arson investigation that was active but unresolved. Not Cole, who was still learning to talk about things before they became weight he'd been carrying too long. Not Sadie, who was still doing too much and trusting too little and occasionally watching Evelyn from the doorway with an expression that was equal parts affection and assessment, as if she hadn't entirely decided to stop checking. Not Evelyn herself, who had come here with nothing and built something she hadn't been looking for and wasn't sure she deserved, and had chosen anyway. Ruth Alden came to stand beside her. "How are you holding up?" Ruth asked. "I'm all right," Evelyn said. And then, more honestly, "I'm tired, but I'm all right." Ruth looked at the barn frame. "Vane says he expects the arson investigation to reach a formal conclusion within the month. Someone in Greer's office talked." She said it quietly, not gossip, just fact. The person of interest had dealings with Cross directly. Evelyn absorbed this. "Does Blackwell know?" "I imagine so." Ruth paused. "Men like him don't run. They restructure. He'll distance himself from Cross and find another approach." "I know." Evelyn looked at the barn. "We'll deal with it." Ruth looked at her sideways. "You say that the way Cole used to say it. Before." "Before what?" "Before he had someone to say it with." Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. She stood in the yard with the response letter in her hand and the half-built barn in front of her, and the cold November air coming in from the north, and she thought about the train platform where she'd sat for 2 hours waiting for a man who didn't exist. She thought about what Ruth had said. Before he had someone to say it with. That was what this had become. Not what she'd come for. Not what she'd planned, or hoped for, or allowed herself to want in those early weeks when she'd been sleeping in a dead woman's sewing room and telling herself this was temporary. Somewhere between the accounts and the letters and the Mercer discrepancy and the barn fire and the 4 pages of documentation and a man sitting across a kitchen table asking what he could do, somewhere in all of that, she had stopped saying "I" when she talked about this place and started saying "we," and she hadn't noticed it happening until Cole had. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The loan, the Mercer contract, Blackwell's next move, the barn that needed a roof before December. The accounts she'd run again tonight because the numbers never stayed still, and you had to keep looking at them or they got away from you. She went back inside. Cole was at the table with the revised Mercer terms Vane had sent over, reading them line by line. He looked up when she came in. His eyes went to her face first, the way they'd started doing, checking something she'd noticed, some private accounting she didn't have full visibility into. "Anything urgent?" he said. "Nothing that can't wait until after dinner," she said. He nodded and looked back at the Mercer document. She hung up her coat and started the stove and listened to the sounds of the half-built barn and the wind and Sadie coming in through the back door, arguing with no one in particular about something that had happened at school, and Walt's voice answering from outside with his typical economy of language. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that was still standing. She put water on for coffee and stood at the stove and let that be enough. The courthouse in Black Ridge was not a large building. It had 2 courtrooms, a clerk's office that smelled permanently of old paper, and a row of wooden benches in the main hall that had been worn smooth by years of people sitting on them, waiting for things to be decided. Evelyn had been in the building 3 times before today, once for land records, once to file the water rights amendment documents on Vane's behalf, once briefly when Greer had needed a signature on something related to the arson investigation. Today was different. She and Cole arrived early, which was Cole's instinct in any situation that mattered. Get there before it starts. Understand the room before anything happens in it. Vane was already inside, standing near the clerk's window with a leather case that had more paper in it than Evelyn had seen him carry before. He looked up when they came in and gave a single nod, the kind that meant things were in order. Walt had stayed at the ranch with Sadie, which had been the source of a significant argument that morning. "I should be there," Sadie had said, at the breakfast table, with the focused intensity she brought to any position she'd decided was correct. "You should be in school," Cole said. "School is not more important than this." "School is always more important," Cole said, and the tone he used was the one that meant the conversation was done, which Sadie knew perfectly well and acknowledged by eating the rest of her breakfast in a pointed silence that communicated her feelings with impressive precision. When Evelyn had gone to say goodbye, Sadie was in the yard pretending to check on the horses. She turned when she heard footsteps, and her face did the thing it did when she was trying to look like she wasn't concerned about something. "It's going to be fine," Evelyn said. "You don't know that for certain." "No," Evelyn agreed. "But Vane does, and he's not a man who says things he doesn't mean." Sadie looked at the horses. "Cross is going to be there." "Yes." "Don't let him—" She stopped, rearranged whatever she'd been about to say. "Just don't let him do that thing he does, where he sounds reasonable." "I know what he sounds like," Evelyn said. "So does the judge." Sadie nodded, once, still not looking at her. Then, quietly, "Come back with good news." Evelyn had put her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder, and Sadie had let her, which was its own kind of thing, and then she'd gone to get in the wagon with Cole. Now sitting in the courtroom on a bench that was every bit as hard as it looked, she watched the room fill. Ruth Alden came in and sat 2 rows back, which Evelyn hadn't expected. Nathan Briggs was there, which she also hadn't expected. Tom Aldred, the rancher who'd brought timber for the barn rebuild. The woman who ran the general store. 3 or 4 other people whose faces she recognized from town meetings, and whose names she was still learning. They hadn't come because she'd asked them to. She hadn't asked anyone. They'd come because in a place like Black Ridge, a courtroom wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a statement about whose version of things the community was prepared to stand behind. Cole noticed too. She saw him take in the room without turning his head, the quiet inventory of a man who doesn't make a show of being surprised. He didn't say anything, but the set of his shoulders changed slightly, the way it did when he was carrying something and someone put a hand under it. Damian Cross arrived with a lawyer from Tucson, younger than Vane, sharp-suited, with the kind of controlled energy that said he'd argued in bigger courtrooms than this one and wanted that known. Cross himself sat at the opposite table with the settled ease he carried everywhere, the manufactured calm of a man who believed he was the most capable person in any room he entered. He looked at Evelyn when he sat down. She looked back at him and then looked away, because he was not worth holding her attention on. Blackwell was not there. She had not expected him to be. The judge was a woman named Harriet Combe, who had been on the territorial bench for 11 years, and who entered the courtroom with the efficiency of someone who had a full docket and intended to work through it. She was perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of a person who had heard every possible argument and was reserving judgment on all of them. The claim Cross had filed was threefold. First, that Evelyn's presence at the Walker Ranch prior to the marriage had constituted an improper influence on a financially vulnerable party, rendering certain decisions made during that period legally questionable. Second, that documents filed during that period, specifically the Water Rights Amendment and the letter to the Banking Oversight Office, had been made without proper authority. Third, a residual version of the harassment claim that his first petition had attempted, now reframed in language Vane had told her was so thin it barely warranted a response. Vane's response to the first claim was built on 3 years of territorial legal precedent, establishing that a person hired in a professional consulting capacity had full legal authority to act on behalf of the hiring party when explicitly authorized to do so, and that Cole Walker's written authorization, documented, dated, witnessed by Walt, was in the record. The consulting arrangement had been above board from the first week. Every significant action Evelyn had taken had been reviewed and authorized by Cole. The response to the second claim was even shorter. The Water Rights Amendment had been filed by Robert Vane, attorney at law, acting on behalf of Cole Walker, the registered property owner. The letter to the Banking Oversight Office had been signed by Cole Walker himself. Neither required Evelyn's authority. Both were legally sound. The third claim Vane addressed in a single paragraph that the judge appeared to read while Cross's lawyer was still setting up his notes. What made the difference? What turned the proceeding from a question of competing claims into something considerably more decisive was the documentation. Vane laid it out methodically. The file Evelyn had been building since her second week at the ranch. Dates, events, names, the sequence of actions taken against the Walker property and by whom had been organized into a legal exhibit that told a story any reasonable person could follow. The Mercer weight discrepancies, documented with Walt's notebook alongside the official receipts. The correspondence with Hargrove, including the timing of his inquiry about a property transition in relation to his communications with Blackwell's office, obtained through the banking oversight investigation. The boot prints at the south fence line, the coal oil evidence at the burn site, Greer's documentation of the same. And finally, and this was the piece Vane had been waiting to introduce, the piece he'd told her about privately 2 days earlier. A sworn statement from the person of interest in the arson investigation, a man named Carey who had worked intermittently for Cross as a hired hand and who had, in the context of a plea arrangement with Greer's office, provided a specific and detailed account of being paid to set the Walker barn on fire. Carey's statement named Damian Cross directly. It did not name Victor Blackwell. Vane had told her to expect that, and not to be surprised by it. Men like Blackwell kept enough distance between themselves and the specific acts that they were rarely the named party in anything. That wasn't the same as being safe. The banking oversight investigation was ongoing. Greer's expanded inquiry had been referred to territorial authorities who had more reach than a county sheriff, and the picture being assembled was larger than the Walker Ranch. But Blackwell's name was not in today's documents, and she had made herself accept that. Cross's lawyer objected to the introduction of Carey's statement on technical grounds that took 20 minutes to argue and that the judge overruled in 4 sentences. Evelyn watched Cross during this because she'd learned that you understood more about a situation by watching the person who had the most to lose than by watching the person winning. Cross's face stayed professionally composed through most of it. But when the judge read the specific paragraph of Carey's statement aloud, the paragraph with the amount Cross had paid, and the date, and the instruction to make it look like an accident, something in Cross's expression went very briefly wrong. Just a second, just a fraction of a second where the calculation behind the ease became visible. She filed that away. Judge Combs' ruling on Cross's claims was comprehensive and brisk. The improper influence claim was dismissed with a notation that it lacked both factual and legal foundation. The document authority claim was dismissed on the grounds that the record clearly established proper authorization. The harassment claim was dismissed, and Cross was formally cautioned that further filings of this nature would be treated as abuse of process. And then the judge turned to the arson documentation. She said that while the current proceeding was not a criminal trial, the evidence before her regarding the fire was sufficiently clear that she was referring the matter formally to the territorial court with a strong recommendation for criminal prosecution. She used the word deliberate and the phrase coordinated pattern of interference, and she said both of them looking directly at Cross. Cross's lawyer leaned in to say something to his client. Cross listened, nodded, and said nothing. It was over in less than 3 hours. Outside on the courthouse steps, Vane shook Cole's hand and told him that the territorial referral was significant. It meant the arson case would be tried at a level where Blackwell's local relationships with bank officers and county officials carried considerably less weight. He said it in the measured, precise way he said everything, but Evelyn caught something in his expression that was close to satisfaction. Ruth Alden came down the steps and stood next to Evelyn. "Well," Ruth said.
"Well," Evelyn agreed. Ruth looked out at the main street of Black Ridge, at the ordinary Friday afternoon going on around them. Blackwell's going to feel this, even without his name in the documents today. The banking investigation, the territorial referral, he's going to have to spend a lot of time and money managing the fallout. "Is that enough?" Evelyn asked. She meant it as a real question, not a rhetorical one.
Ruth considered it. "No," she said. "Probably not entirely. Men like him find ways to persist, but his water corridor project is finished. Without the Walker property in the middle of it, the whole scheme falls apart, And the investigation means no legitimate investor is going to touch it now. She paused. That's real damage. That's something he can't recover from quickly, if at all. Cole came to stand beside Evelyn. He'd been talking to Nathan Briggs, and he had the look of a man who'd finished something that had been sitting on him for a long time. Vane says the Mercer renegotiation will close by end of month, he said. I know. He told me. New terms are close to what you projected. Close to, she said. Not exactly. Close enough, he said. And that was Cole's version of satisfaction. Not effusive, not dramatic, just the acknowledgement that a thing had landed where it needed to land. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and Evelyn sat beside Cole on the wagon bench and watched the landscape go past. The scrub brush, the pale grass, the dry creek beds, the hills she'd been looking at for 3 months now, and had stopped finding alien. They'd become familiar in the way landscapes became familiar when you stopped passing through them and started living in them. She noticed things in them now, the way the light hit the north section differently in the afternoon, the particular color of the grass when the first frost had been through. Cole drove without talking, which was his usual way, and she sat without talking, which had become hers when she was with him, and the silence between them was the kind that had stopped requiring explanation. When they crested the last rise and the ranch came into view, she saw Sadie on the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. The girl came down the steps at a near run and stopped herself approximately 10 feet from the wagon with the visible effort of someone who had decided not to look desperate. Well, Sadie said. We won, Cole said, climbing down. Sadie's expression went through several things in rapid succession and ended up at something that was attempting to be dignified and not entirely succeeding. I knew it would be fine, she said. You were worried the whole day, Cole said. I was not. Walt says you reorganized the tack room twice. The tack room needed organizing. Cole looked at her with the expression Evelyn had come to love on him. The dry, warm, completely undemonstrative affection of a man who was not good at saying things and had found other ways to say them. He put his hand briefly on top of Sadie's head, the way you do with a child, and Sadie made a sound of protest but didn't move. Then Sadie looked at Evelyn, who had climbed down from the wagon and was brushing dust from her coat. Cross? Sadie said. Criminal referral to the territorial court. He'll be prosecuted for the arson. She met the girl's eyes. It's done, Sadie breathed out. It was a very controlled breath, the kind that had some shaking in it, that she was working to keep out. Then she squared her shoulders and said, Good, and went back inside, which was how Sadie Walker handled most things that mattered too much to handle in front of people. Walt appeared from the direction of the barn and looked at Cole, and Cole nodded and Walt nodded back, and that appeared to be the full extent of that conversation, which seemed to satisfy both of them. The months that followed were not easy, because nothing about building something worthwhile is easy, but they were the good kind of hard, the kind where the difficulty is in the work itself rather than in fighting for the right to do the work. The Mercer contract was renegotiated and signed in December, at terms that saved the ranch a significant portion of what it had been losing every year. Cole read the new contract carefully before he signed it, which Evelyn had noticed he now did with every document. Not mistrustfully, just with the attention of a man who understood that what's written matters and is worth understanding. She had never pointed out the change in him. It didn't need pointing out. The end-of-year payment, restructured across 2 additional quarters per the banking oversight agreement, was made on schedule. The first installment went out in January with the satisfaction of something crossing a line that had been in doubt for a long time. The second went out in March. By the following autumn, the principal was reduced enough that the projections, which Evelyn still ran every month, showed a clear path to full repayment within 2 years. Cross was tried in the territorial court in the spring. The proceedings took 4 days. Carey's testimony was the centerpiece, corroborated by financial records obtained during the investigation that traced the payment from Cross's accounts. The verdict came back guilty on the arson charge and 2 additional counts of property interference. He was sentenced to 6 years and left Black Ridge in the custody of a territorial marshal, and that was the last Evelyn saw of him. Blackwell was never charged. She'd known to expect that, and knowing it didn't make it entirely comfortable to sit with. Men like Blackwell moved through the world at a level of remove that made direct legal accountability difficult. The banking investigation had examined his relationship with Hargrove's office and found enough to result in Hargrove's resignation from the bank under pressure from the oversight board. And the water corridor project had collapsed completely when 3 of Blackwell's financial backers withdrew following the investigation's publicity. His land holdings in the county were eventually sold off quietly over the following year, not because he was legally compelled to, but because the project was dead and the properties were liabilities now instead of assets. It wasn't justice in the complete sense. Evelyn had thought about this more than once, late at night in the way you thought about things that didn't resolve cleanly. What Blackwell lost was money and ambition, and the particular plan he'd been building for years. What he didn't lose was his freedom. Whether those were commensurate losses for what he'd set in motion, the sick cattle, the barn fire, the legal harassment, the years of systematic pressure on a family that was already struggling, she couldn't say. She'd never be able to say. What she'd decided, somewhere around the 3rd sleepless night she spent on it, was that justice was rarely the whole clean thing people imagined when they wanted it. It was usually partial, usually imperfect, usually arrived at sideways rather than head-on. What mattered was that the pattern had been broken, the harm had been stopped, the record existed, and the people who'd been targeted were still standing. That was real. That was not nothing. She wrote that down in the journal she kept. Not the documentation file, which had been submitted to Vane and was now part of the legal record, but her personal journal, the one she'd started keeping in the cedar-smelling sewing room during the first weeks at the ranch. She wrote it down because she had a habit, formed young, of writing things down when she'd decided something and wanted to remember that she'd decided it. The sewing room was not her room anymore. She and Cole had moved her things into the main bedroom in December, which had been an unremarkable domestic transition that somehow wasn't unremarkable at all. The cedar chest from the sewing room had gone to the hallway, where it served now as a useful surface for boots and hats, and the miscellaneous objects that accumulated in households with people who worked outside. Martha Walker's quilt stayed on the bed. Evelyn had asked Cole about it once, carefully, whether he wanted it moved or stored. He'd thought about it for a moment and said no, leave it. She'd understood that as what it was, not absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling he'd made peace with, the acknowledgement that the past didn't have to be locked away in order for the present to be real. Sadie had watched the quilt stay on the bed without comment, which Evelyn read as acceptance. The ranch changed in the way things change when they stop fighting for survival and start figuring out what they actually want to be. Cole made decisions that had been deferred for years. A second water trough for the north section, a proper cover for the hay storage that reduced winter losses, a selective expansion of the herd once the financial picture stabilized. He made these decisions in conversation with Evelyn, which was new for him and which he had had to learn, the same way she'd had to learn that her opinions about land and livestock were worth contributing even when she wasn't sure. They disagreed sometimes, fairly regularly actually. Cole had strong instincts about the cattle operation that were sometimes at odds with the financial logic she was running, and she had positions about resource allocation that he thought were too conservative. They'd had 3 or 4 arguments that had been genuine arguments, voices raised slightly, positions held past comfort, the particular friction of 2 people who both thought clearly and neither of whom deferred easily. Every one of those arguments had ended with a decision that was better than what either of them had walked in with. She'd noted that. She suspected he had too, though he hadn't said so. Nathan Briggs renewed the grazing lease for a 2nd year and then a 3rd. Clara Briggs became something close to a friend, the kind that came from genuine temperamental affinity rather than proximity, which was rarer and more valuable. Ruth Alden remained a consistent presence, the kind of fixed point in a community that a place needed to function. And Evelyn had taken on a role in the Thursday meetings that she hadn't planned, but that had grown organically from simply being the person who understood the county's land and water situation better than most. Walt got a raise, which he received by tilting his hat approximately 2 degrees and saying nothing, which Evelyn had learned was his version of expressing significant emotion. Sadie grew. Not slowly the way children grew when you weren't paying attention, but in the particular visible way of a child moving into adolescence. Legs longer, face sharpening, opinions stronger and more specifically articulated. She had always been capable. She became, as she grew, formidably so. A girl with a complete internal compass, a talent for reading people, and the particular kind of intelligence that didn't show off but that you noticed increasingly over time. She started coming to Evelyn with questions about the accounts, not asking to be taught, not formally, but bringing things she'd observed or wondered about and asking what they meant. Evelyn answered as directly as she'd always answered Sadie, without condescension, without simplification, treating her like a person capable of understanding what was actually being said. Cole watched these conversations from across the kitchen with an expression that Evelyn sometimes caught and that she would have described, if pressed, as the look of a man seeing something he'd hoped for without knowing he'd been hoping for it. One evening in the spring of the second year, Sadie was at the table with the accounts spread in front of her, working through the quarterly projection Evelyn had started, and asked her to finish. Cole was at the stove making coffee in the way he'd started making coffee. Slightly better than before, still not good exactly, but improved. The barn was complete, properly roofed, straight enough. The evening sounds of the ranch came in through the window. Cattle, the creak of the fence, the dry sound of the wind in the grass. Evelyn sat down across from Sadie and looked at the numbers the girl had run. "You made an error in the third column," she said. Sadie pulled the paper back and looked. "Where?" "The Briggs lease income. You used last year's rate." Sadie found it. "Oh." She corrected it without frustration, the clean response of a person who accepted correction as information rather than criticism. She'd always been like that, Evelyn realized, even at 11, even the first time they'd sat across a table from each other in a train station in a town where neither of them had planned to be. She took in what was true and worked with it. "Better," Evelyn said. Sadie looked at the corrected projection for a moment. "We're going to be fine this year," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Better than fine." "Getting there." Sadie folded the paper and put it in the accounts file with the precision of someone who'd learned where things went and put them there. Then she looked at Evelyn with the frank, considered look she'd carried since childhood. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I know I've said that before." "You can say it again." "I'm glad you came," Sadie said. "Even the way it happened, the man who wasn't real, and the terrible day at the train station and all of it." She paused. "I know that sounds strange." "It doesn't," Evelyn said. It didn't. It was the truest thing either of them had said in a while, which was saying something because they were both people who tried to say true things. Evelyn had thought about Thomas Aldridge, or whoever had written those letters with their warm, specific detail and their complete absence of truth, less often as the months passed. In the early weeks, she'd thought about it with the hot ash quality of humiliation, the reminder of how thoroughly she'd arranged her life around a lie. Later, she'd thought about it with a cooler, more complicated feeling, the understanding that the lie had delivered her somewhere real, which didn't make the lie acceptable and didn't mean she'd forgiven whoever had written it, but meant that she could hold both things at once, the wrongness of what had been done and the strange, unearned gift of where it had led. She had come to believe over time that this was actually how most lives worked. Not that cruelty was secretly kindness or that betrayal was secretly guidance. Those were the kind of comfortable constructions that dissolved under examination. But that the worst things that happened to you were sometimes also the things that moved you, that broke the trajectory you'd been on and sent you somewhere you'd never have chosen and couldn't have imagined. The value wasn't in the harm. The value was in what you did once you were somewhere you hadn't planned to be. She'd arrived in Black Ridge with nothing but a traveling case and the specific kind of shame that came from being made a fool of in front of the whole trajectory of your life. She'd stayed because she'd had nowhere to go, and a child had asked her with the complete pragmatic confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world mostly said no. She'd built something here, not from nothing. Cole Walker's stubbornness and Walt's honesty and Sadie's remarkable specific capability had been here, waiting for someone to see them clearly. But she had seen them clearly, and she'd used every skill she had to protect what was worth protecting. And in the process of doing that, she'd found herself in possession of a life she wouldn't trade for the one she'd been going toward. That was not a tidy lesson. It was not the kind of thing you could put in a sentence and pass along to someone else. Life didn't work in sentences. What she knew was this. She had been humiliated and stranded and frightened, and she had gotten up from the bench at the train station and gone with a stranger's child anyway. And that choice, made from the narrow set of options available to her on one of the worst days she'd ever had been the right one. Not because it had been easy or because it had immediately been safe or because anyone had guaranteed her that it would work out, but because it had been, under all the uncertainty, the choice that was actually hers. Not what someone else had written for her, not the life that had been constructed around a fiction. Her own. Cole came to the table with 2 cups of coffee, his improved but still suboptimal coffee, and set one in front of her and sat down, and Sadie went upstairs to do whatever 11-year-olds going on 15 did in their rooms, and the ranch settled into the particular sound of a late spring evening in the high country, and Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cup and looked across the table at this man she'd chosen, and who had chosen her back, imperfectly and practically, and with the particular honesty of people who'd both been through enough to know better than to pretend.
"Long day," he said. "Good day," she said.
He looked at her over his cup. Outside, the wind moved through the new grass of the north pasture, the same grass Nathan Briggs's sheep would be grazing in a month. The barn stood solid against the darkening sky, the barn the town had built from the ruin of something someone had tried to destroy. It leaned slightly to the right, which Walt still claimed would settle, and which Evelyn had documented as structurally adequate and had quietly decided she liked. Sadie ran the quarterly projections, she said. She caught most of it herself. Cole absorbed this. How much of it? Enough. She looked at him. She's going to be good at this. Better than me, eventually. Cole was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was feeling something he was deciding how to hold. Then, she was always going to be good at something, she just needed... He stopped. Someone to show her, Evelyn finished. He nodded, once. They sat with that. There was still work tomorrow. There was always still work tomorrow. Accounts to run, decisions to make, the ongoing, unglamorous management of a place that required constant attention. The loan was not fully repaid yet. The Blackwell situation had resolved, but resolution wasn't the same as erasure, and the county would carry the marks of that particular few years for a while yet. Life on a ranch in the high country was never entirely settled, and she'd stopped wanting it to be. The unsettled parts were where most of the interesting things happened. What she knew sitting here was that the life in this kitchen was real. Not the life she'd written to her cousin Margaret about from Ohio, not the life she'd imagined while reading letters by lamplight that had turned out to be entirely fictional. This one. The one with the imperfect coffee, and the accounts on the table, and the girl upstairs who organized the tack room when she was anxious, and the man across from her who showed his feelings through the careful, persistent attention he paid to things he cared about. This one, which had started on the worst day she could remember, in a train station in a town she'd never heard of, when a child with axle grease on her cheek and oversized boots had walked in and said, "I have a proposition," she'd said yes. She'd keep saying yes. That was the whole of it, really. Not courage in the grand sense, not destiny, not the invisible machinery of a fate working itself out. Just a woman who had nothing left to lose, saying yes to the only thing being offered, and then showing up and keeping showing up until the yes became a life. Outside, the last light went out of the sky over the Walker Ranch, and the stars came out over the high country, cold and specific and very far away. And inside the kitchen, the lamp burned and the coffee cooled and the accounts sat in their file ready for tomorrow. And Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Walker now, though she still thought of herself by both names and probably always would, looked at what she'd helped build from the wreckage of what she'd lost, and found that it was improbably and completely enough.